Okay, we are live. Good morning to everybody, and welcome to the June 13th, 2026 edition of the Free School. We're going to be picking up where we left off last Saturday, and so we're going to continue our discussion of the Chinese civilization state. And as part of that, we're going to talk about how China is governed, and that question that we've brought up before in the class with Free School of a triad of a state of the whole people, the Communist Party of China, and the people themselves. And so Michelle and Albert are going to start us off. Alice is also going to speak, and then we'll have a discussion. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Michelle and Albert.
Okay, thanks, Jeremiah. So Albert and I are going to cover three main points in our discussion before Alice presents. We're going to talk a little bit about how we see our approach to China as members of Free School. Second, to address to some extent the synthesis with Du Bois. And then third, to talk about Zhang Weiwei in particular. And I think that piece especially continues on the threads that we opened up in our last discussion. So for anyone who wasn't present last week, at the end of last week's Free School, Albert and I gave a brief summary of our visit to China and how we had been processing the experience ideologically and politically. We didn't really get to discuss it as Free School, so we're hoping that a lot of that discussion can happen today. And I just wanted to begin by saying again that we really feel our purpose for seeing China and studying China is to inherit China's achievement as a world historic civilization in the 21st century, our struggle in America in the 21st century. So to really gain something from the world and to receive this gift on behalf of humanity, but also on behalf of the American people. In Free School, this is the 250th. This is something that we've established over and over the last 6 months. And in Free School, we've constantly had this very diligent framing of the American situation as a profound crisis. And in 2026, we've established that this crisis has reached untenable proportions. And just constantly trying to theorize what is the way forward, what is the way out of all of this. I say this because that category of the crisis has been so important to our worldview. And I think of the crisis has been so important to our worldview. And I think it's part of why we take the concrete reality of the American people so seriously, is because we demand to know scientifically what explains this crisis, what constitutes it, how is it shifting, how are people responding to it? All which provide us a way to answer these deep questions. So I think, this is why we were very inspired looking to China, because I feel that the Chinese story of the 21st century has been one of great civilizational flourishing. And we can talk about this when we talk about Du Bois, but I see it as almost like a parallel period of reconstruction. And that's what makes it so rich, is to juxtapose that against our constant assessment of the US crisis and how it will be addressed. So we really see China in the 21st century as having made an enormous contribution to the achievement of world democracy. Just all of these remarkable political, economic, social, cultural advancements in the last 3 to 4 decades. So one quick anecdote like I wanted to give since last week is I returned to work this week, and then I work at the school district. And many of my coworkers and colleagues asked me like, oh, where have you been? And I was just very direct. I said, oh, like Albert and I went to China for 2 weeks. And I was really struck by the responses of many of my coworkers, especially the Black coworkers. And I felt embraced by my coworkers as if I had gone on a pilgrimage. And it's because, of course, I delivered the experience that way. but everyone was just so excited to know. I mean, the people that I passed through going from office to office, the security guards, and they really resonated with this framing that China is a world historic force for peace in the world today, and that it represents an alternative to the contradictions of Western civilization. There was just so much energy to know China, to see China in the 21st century. And I especially experienced this with my Black coworkers. So I wanted to say this, or to begin on this note, because my intention with our discussions about China and free school at this stage are to really set a foundation from which we can pursue this larger, longer study. And I just want to say that this is how I see our purpose, to absorb something that I believe we must, as people who are intent about changing the situation here, the political situation here, and that there are many questions of governance, questions of the state, questions of the people, of consciousness that have already been steadily worked out by China that we can learn from for much of our work here. So something that Albert and I had also discussed or talked about before today was some of the synthesis or parallels that we were seeing between, especially Zhang Weiwei's worldview, which had framed a lot of the way we saw China, and Du Bois. And I had referenced this in our remarks last week, but I think that we were seeing Du Bois's worldview all over China subconsciously. It was framing how we were seeing everything. I think most crucial is that centrality of the Black worker. And we'll come to this later in the presentation, but we were asking ourselves, to what extent are the people we see here aspiring toward that worldview of the Black worker as the central motive agent of revolutionary history? For example, I know that in the Lucian Blackwell Reading Group, and then also in the Chicago Reading Group, 2 parallel and valuable studies have been going on of the Reconstruction period. And this is also a crucial period that we refer to in free school over and over again, that we believe explains the crisis today, that defeat of the Reconstruction era. And we felt in seeing China that we saw a promise of world democracy that could have been achieved had there not been a counter-revolution on Reconstruction, on Black Reconstruction. In my notes, I had said that, when we heard the song of China, just seeing China, we were really hearing the voice of the Black worker. And I don't know how well I'm depicting it, but I think this is something worth pursuing, is that Du Boisian synthesis with the modern civilizational achievements of China. So this is actually something that I'm going to pass over to Albert, and he's going to speak a little bit more about.
So I think what really helped frame the trip for me was our background in Du Bois. And prior to going, Michelle and I both read China and Africa, which was Du Bois's speech at Beijing University in 1959. And reading it and then going to China, it really helped me see the manifestation of what Du Bois had already seen in the Chinese people. Not only what they were doing, but now we can see the further development of what he had seen. And there were just a lot of moving things, like in in China and Africa, he mentions how China is essentially one with the colored people, He goes as far as to say that in referencing Africa, he's like, China is flesh of your flesh and blood of your blood. And then he references a point in time during the century of humiliation when the Chinese people weren't allowed or were forbidden to access their own land, whether it's like parks, because they were specifically for either the feudal system or for the colonial system, whether it's for the dynasty or like for higher ranking people or for international relationships. But regardless, common people weren't allowed in these spaces. But going to China now, you see all this space dedicated to the people, whether it's Tiananmen Square, this vast like court where people can just be, or their parks. Like everyone can go to these and feel like it's like a local thing. Or even these museums. The museums are very much designed for the people and not just for profit. And the CPC museum is designed in a way where the whole time in the exhibit, you are in the central area, and then the exhibit is in the surrounding area. So you go through the exhibit, and then you go back to the center, and then you slowly rise through the museum, escalating, to kind of see the journey that Chinese people have taken through the century accumulation to modernity. Another thing that we really witnessed was the vitality of the people. That the Chinese people had really fulfilled what King and Du Bois had seen as the moral responsibility of the state or the government. What King would say that every person should have a decent house, an adequate education, and enough money to provide basic necessities for one's family. Or what Du Bois would say, it is then one's moral duty to see that every human being, to the extent of his capacity, escapes ignorance, poverty, and crime. With this high ideal held unswervingly in view, monarchy, oligarchy, dictatorships may rule, but the end will be the rule of all, if may have all or most qualified. And then this is made even more concrete through the anecdote that Michelle had shared last week of how we could go to a massage, like, not studio, but like a place, and then even these people who were blind, born blind, or have deficits in their sight, can actually have a career and can actually inherit a certain civilizational wisdom of traditional Chinese medicine or traditional Chinese practices. And then the third thing that I would point to would be the governance, which I think Alice will expand more on later. But yeah, that the Chinese people have really carried out what Du Bois had been talking about, whether it's in Black Reconstruction or in the ruling of men, that you really need to uplift the worker, and that you need to create, like, the welfare of the entire state is paramount to a functioning civilization. I say all that to really say that in China and Africa, Du Bois was speaking to Africa in a sense, but I think today he speaks to Americans. And the fact that Americans are so curious about what's happening in China, I think that shows that American people are actually closer in spirit to the colored people than ever before. And also, in looking to China, they're seeing the mirror or a mirror of the possibilities of Reconstruction and the consequences of having plucked that flower before it had borne fruit. And Du Bois writes in The Black Proletariat of South Carolina that the tragedy of Reconstruction was that, or the failure or the overthrow of it, was that this was not the opportunity to study a great human experience present in Reconstruction, and its careful scientific investigation would have thrown a world of light on human development and democratic government. The material today, however, is unfortunately difficult to find. So in a sense, me connecting all the dots of having the privilege of reading Black Reconstruction, the Ordeal of Mansart, and going to China, is to realize that actually this spotlight that's on China today could have been the spotlight that was on the US had the US taken the ideals of Reconstruction further, that we could have actually created a civilizational wisdom for the United States, and that could have been something, a great contribution to the world. But instead, we've kind of squandered that opportunity, and it's now the Chinese people who have taken up or inherited that responsibility or that development. And that's pretty much the main points that I wanted to make. But I think going forward, to me, the Chinese people and the American people are still trying to find each other. We continue to be mirrors for one another. And I think this thing that Du Bois writes in the Ruling of Men, let me find it. He says that he had been talking about how people are surprised, like men are surprised when they find other men thinking like them across the world. And then he says, all this proves that none are so blind as those nearest things seen. While on the other hand, the history of the world is the history of the discovery of the common humanity of human beings among steadily increasing circles of men. So I think this applies both to Americans and to the Chinese in different ways, that Americans have been blind to their own, the failures of their own civilization, or the failure to take it even further or develop it even further. And now they're seeing it further mirrored internationally. And on the other hand, we have China, who, as we had mentioned last week, even the Chinese have been kind of resistant to this idea that they could be on the world stage in this way. That even though Zhang Weiwei's narrative was embraced internationally, it encountered a lot of resistance domestically. And it showed, to me, that says that even the Chinese were too close to their own rapid development. And it's actually through internationally, but especially through Americans, or even especially through Black America and Reconstruction, that they can see their efforts mirrored back to them. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
So one more thing I wanted to say about the connection to the Du Boisian worldview is, I think the extent to which we take Du Bois as like a lodestar for our thinking and our theory in preschool. I really feel that it's that Du Boisian worldview that allowed us to see China as emerging from a revolutionary process almost immediately. And I think that's what that connection to the Reconstruction period, like Albert is saying, gave us. Because again, like he's emphasizing, I think Weiwei puts this thesis very square, very strongly in the 21st century, that China has achieved a world historic contribution. And that was difficult for the majority of Chinese people and intellectuals to accept at that time. But I feel it was highly compatible with the Du Boisian worldview, because what we were seeing was a nonviolent achievement of the state of the whole people, at least in process, in the process of becoming. And kind of like Albert said, I think we were stunned to actually feel that almost like unbroken continuity between the promise of the Black workers' leadership in the Reconstruction period leaping into the 21st century, and just seeing many imprints of it in China. That's what I mean when I say that we just saw Du Bois all over China. We can talk about it, but from my understanding, that's a very Du Boisian approach to revolution, as opposed to the Marxist-Leninist concept of revolution. We didn't go and see 1911, overthrow of the dynastic period, like 1949, achievement of the state. We were really interested in the period between 1980 and 2020, beginning with, what I would call, but, we can negotiate the vocabulary, like China's Reconstruction. So to move into the last part of our presentation, we want to revisit some of the core ideas from Weiwei, including the civilization state, but really to bring in that Du Boisian worldview. So I mentioned this last week, but we have the opportunity to present a written interview to Zhang Weiwei and I think we should move forward with it. I was hoping that in this discussion we can actually negotiate or discuss some of the questions that we feel are urgent for us to bring to him. So based on our discussion from last week, or what we had already drafted, like we had 3 or 4 questions to start. One is, how do you explain the phenomenon of a Zhang Weiwei sociologically? His ideological confidence, his courage in his assessment of Chinese civilization, and how it was a result of his mentorship by Deng Xiaoping, this visionary leader who did have to steer a nation out of potential chaos and potential collapse, like the Chinese, the crisis in China following Mao's death. Second is, this is openly recognized by CPC leadership and was also recognized by Weiwei and Deng Xiaoping, but China has undergone rapid industrial material development in a very short span of time. This has introduced challenges or contradictions in the consciousness, especially of the younger generation. So, a question that we wanted to ask Weiwei is, at this point, what does he think is crucial to that next stage of the Chinese consciousness, in which the Chinese youth are able to embrace their world historic task in making a contribution to humanity? And part of the question I'm trying to ask here is to test to what extent we believe the Chinese youth are really searching for colored modernity or searching for a Kingian worldview, a Kingian way to explain the world, to be responsible to the world. The third question, what is the new role of the Chinese intellectual who comes to the West to be trained? So the reason that I thought of this question is because the time that Weiwei is coming up, he's in his 60s. So, coming up in the 70s, 80s. Obviously, at that time, the Chinese intellectuals feel like underdogs to Western hegemony, even into the 21st century. And I think Weiwei's struggle against his intellectual class was that so many of these Chinese intellectuals had inherited that white supremacist or Western supremacist worldview, and that the Western worldview was forever superior to an Asiatic political, economic, civilizational analysis of the world. I think that especially in this moment, more than ever, that reality is changing. I think what's interesting is that with China's rise, it's not as if fewer Chinese come west. I would have to look at the numbers, but my sense is that at least the same amount, if not more, continue to come west. And we've talked about this in preschool. Like, Doc, you shared this when you guys had gone up to New York about your observations at NYU. And having seen the demographic body of Penn for over 10 years, I've definitely noticed this as the biggest trend. And other people will say it as well, just a dramatic number of Chinese students present, on these Western universities. So, a question that essentially gets at the meaning of that, because I believe that continued ideological civilizational contact between China and America as perhaps the two historically very consequential civilizations in the 21st century will continue. On what terms will that occur, or must it occur? Because the Chinese intellectual who is looking to bridge, their worldview with that Western worldview is going to continue to be important. So I think we can begin there, and then we can continue discussing. But to finish, I wanted to bring up a few points from our Weiwei studies. So to recap, we introduced this book last week, and it's called The China Wave. It's his second book in a trilogy of 3 that I think really were the crystallization of his worldview in the 21st century. So central to his thesis is the rise of China as a civilization state and the rise of China as a world historic force in the 21st century, one of the most consequential events of the 21st century. We've already said this a couple times, but I just want to emphasize again that when this book came out in 2011, Ivy, who's Weiwei's younger colleague, asserted to us multiple times that there was tremendous rejection of his thesis domestically. And
The civilization state.
China's rise as a world historic consequence and the reality that China was already, but absolutely would surpass the West on many measures. So, I wouldn't say China hegemony, but just this truly historic rise of China needing to be confronted by the Chinese people directly. There was pushback to that, because Weiwei came in strong. And when Weiwei released this book in 2011, he said that he did not expect it to be as widely received as it was in China, but it became a tremendous bestseller. I don't remember the number exactly, but it may have been like something like, 11 million copies sold domestically, just like staggering numbers. And what he identified then was a hunger among the Chinese people to know, kind of like Albert said, they had come up just in one historic decade after another of accelerated development. And there was an ideological vacuum that created, that Weiwei is addressing. And what he found was the Chinese people's and the Chinese youth's hunger to know what is the meaning of China in the 21st century. So to come back to the civilization state, just because that's how we introduce today's discussion, I want to say that it is a very core idea to his worldview, and he dedicates a chapter to it in this book. I want to give like a few interesting formulations from that chapter, but he says that a way to view the history of China in the 21st century is from the movement of heaven, quote unquote, to movement to the state. And I want to explain this.
That's interesting.
So heaven is coming out of that Confucian worldview, the civilizational worldview of China. And it was in 1911 with Sun Yat-sen's leadership that the framework of the nation state was really introduced to Chinese governance. And so he describes that 20th century as is a process of synthesis between, I might say essentially like a religious or civilizational framework for governance with a Western democratic, like bourgeois democratic vision for governance. He doesn't say this, but what I would argue is that in the 21st century, having synthesized heaven and the state, civilization and the nation state, they're kind of trying to synthesize again with heaven, with that reach for an even higher form of civilization again that has been modernized. If we say that the nation state was a modernization experience. So I think this is where we find a lot of common ground with our work and worldview and Weiwei's. When he's saying civilization state, he's saying that governance through political authority alone is never enough. Political authority derives from moral authority. And that is very central to the attitude of the Chinese people and the Chinese state. We're talking about our sociology study and our rich study of the Black Gods worldview. And what I see is really that in the model of Chinese governance, we really see governance through the high ideals of love, the human being, the centrality of the human being, obviously morality or moral courage, and beauty, And, we can give more concrete examples, but if you have the right eye, you can see all of this for yourself when you go to China. It's very evident in the way a city is organized, in the way the people are organized, in the way the people self-organize. And just to add like one concrete point from what Albert had described, on one of our last days, we visited the National Library in Beijing. And we felt very close to free school because we deliberately visited on a Saturday. So it was like our Saturday free school. And it's just really moving. Like having read about Du Bois's visits to China or the Soviet Union in the 20th century, just seeing these literally like new civilizations. We felt like we really saw that, like a civilization that's governed through a non-Western worldview, like a more, a peace worldview. And I think it was at least 3 or 4 floors, and there was also a basement. But what was so stunning about it was, one, its scale, but two, that the perimeter of the library is kind of like a rectangle, is all of the shelving, all of the books, all of the printers, all of the reading lounges. And then the center is just one multi-tiered open study room that was filled with students who were studying, but not just students, also elders who were studying and reading. And this is on a Saturday, and it's very beautiful because there are glass panels between the reading section and the study section. So wherever you are in the perimeter of the library, you're always looking in to that body of youth who I believe the Chinese state do identify as the vanguard of their history or their civilization, you really feel a part of the forward movement of society. So for this framework of the civilization state and what it tells us about China's model of governance or the experiment of the Chinese state, I feel it's valuable. I feel there are like a few valuable directions that we could consider taking it in. One of them is, I think it's a valuable framework to guide some of our sociological work. Of course, in the 250th, we've been talking much about this question of governance and what we have already identified as the American people, and especially Black people's capacity for self-governance. He gives a very concrete way to describe, sorry, I'm trying to connect an earlier piece, but he gives a very, I think, like important way to describe this that I want to touch on. So he concretizes the civilization state, he says, through 8 features that he describes as the 4 supers and the 4 uniques. So, very specific. And for the supers, he describes China as super large population, super vast territory, super long traditions, and super rich culture. And then the 4 uniques, a unique language, unique politics, unique society, and a unique economy. So he uses this as justification for why China cannot just be explained as a nation, as a country, as a state, but must be described as a civilization. And when I read this, I just kept thinking of the way that we see Black American civilization. And maybe the supers aren't quite as applicable, but super long traditions, super rich culture, unique language, unique politics, unique world society, unique economy. I see that also as justification for why I've really begun to see Black America not as a social system, but as a civilization. So I just think that the way we flesh out government, the people, civilization, can be really concretized through some of the theories and experiences of the Chinese state. The last thing that I wanted to say is, I had brought this up briefly last week, but the Indian freedom struggle and a lot of Gandhi's theory on the nonviolent state or the nonviolent economy is also a direction that we can continue pursuing. It's not one that I was able to study very much before today, but I think it's really part of the Gandhian worldview that each person has a place in society, which is, again, what was so valuable about the nonviolent Chinese Reconstruction, is whether you're poor, whether you're rich, you have a place and you are one people. And Gandhi has this ideal, for example, of, I've been making my way through some of his studies, and he asks different questions at different points. Like he'll say, we haven't worked out how to get closer to the Indian intellectual class yet. Or he'll say, the rich should not be forced to give up their wealth, but they should be convinced to become trustees of the poor. I think just really seeing China's achievement through the framework of nonviolence and that nonviolent reconstitution of the state, I think some of those answers will be present in the experience of the Indian freedom struggle. So we'll end there for our remarks.
I guess in preparing, I was really trying to grapple with this question of why we are trying to understand China and the Chinese state. And I think Michelle and Albert, you helped to clarify some of that. And part of the reason is that there's a lot, especially for us who are in the West, to run into certain misconceptions about China and without actually knowing China, I think is one. The other part is this question of responsibility as being an American and also to the world, which is to understand the American context and the ways forward. Is it necessary to look at a place like China? I think was the second question I was grappling with. And then I think the third is the complexity actually of China and the Chinese state and the civilizational state. And I know in an earlier free school, I had said that maybe the Chinese state is easier to understand than the US state. But I think in listening to what the conversation that you had with Professor Zhang Wei, and then also in preparing for this free school, I think China is also complex, but in a different way than when you try to study the American state. And I think part of that complexity comes from how much it has developed, as Michelle, you were saying, over the past 70 years. Like how much of the Chinese state actually, even though it's seen as this monolith, the central role of the party, it has gone through many changes actually in the many decades, whether it's the period of Mao, whether it's the period of Deng Xiaoping, the Cultural Revolution, and even today. Like I don't think there is one explanation actually or one static explanation for where China is today. And so I think in those three, like navigating those three, which is like, what are the misconceptions about China? Why are we even studying China? Is it necessary to study China to know the American situation and the paths forward? And then also just the complexity of China. I think a lot of it does have to do with what you're saying, the Du Boisian worldview, or and specifically seeing that as what is undeniable right now is that people do have a question, like even the American people have a question of what exactly is China. And people, I think because of how connected people are through social media, through travel, so forth, and the interconnectedness actually of the world, economy, politics, so forth, there is this question of China. And in particular, I think people, despite a lot of the misconceptions about China or the propaganda against China, there is this feeling that actually maybe there is something in China that is positive and that we must know and study. And part of it is for those who are able to go to China, they do feel maybe they don't have the language for it, but they do feel that it's a safer, it's a cleaner, it's a much more united, organized country. And this is even to the extent where you'll see someone like One Republic, like, I forget who the leader, I think his name's Teddy or something. He's some performer, goes to China, is performing in the Shanghai stadium, and comes back and essentially says, don't listen to what you're being told in the US about, like, particularly the negative things about China, how it's about to collapse, how its people are unhappy. Like, you really have to be there to actually, it's 15 years ahead in all dimensions of life. And I say that to say that because of this, I think there is increasing contact of going there with talking to Chinese people that is available today. And part of it is that you have to navigate, like, what are you actually looking for and trying to understand? Because the ruling elite of this country don't want you to see China. Instead, it's telling you, there is nothing to look out there. This is the best, this is the place to be. There's nothing to learn from the world. And it's a miss for people it is a miss for the American people. And I think the other aspect is that for those in the free school who have the chance to go to China, I think from my perspective, sometimes I say, like, oh, like, I don't know how to explain it. Sometimes I fall into, I don't know how to explain it. Like, you just have to go there. But I'm realizing that for us in this room who are revolutionaries, we have to find, and I'm saying we and me, myself, have to find the language actually to explain what is going on in China and what it means for the American people. What is clear, I guess back to the Du Boisian framework, is that what is clear among the people of China is that they are not an oppressed people by the state in terms of their relationships to the state. When you go there, you don't have the same level of immiseration and violence and depression among the people. There are challenges of a large society, of employment, of so forth, but it's not, you don't see a people who feel that the state is antagonistic to them. There may be problems in society, but there isn't a sense that, for example, Beijing, like 5 to 10 years ago, one of the largest problems is air pollution. You go to a city like Beijing, because of the rapid industrialization of factories present, it was like you were smoking cigarettes, like 15 packs of cigarettes a day in China, walking in the streets. And you can also, I haven't been to Beijing, I have only been once, but this was like maybe 5 to 10 years ago. But then now you go to China, or go to Beijing specifically, it's completely changed. The air quality is much better than actually in places in the United States. And I say that as an example of there are problems and there are challenges, but it's not a challenge or crisis of the state. Mm-hmm. People see that things, when there are problems, things are being addressed and fixed pretty rapidly. And those instances give the people confidence in the state to to know their issues and to address those issues. So in trying to understand China, I think there are a couple of pieces or several concepts that I think we've held on to understand China from a Du Boisian framework, which is who are the people, where are they at, and what is their capacity to govern or to build unity and to govern that is responsive to the masses of the people. And this is where it gets complicated, because I think that's where we're bringing in this triad of the state, the party, and the people. And it is a model that I think China has experimented with over the past several decades. And even in looking at this, I was trying to understand, like, what is a state? what is a government? What is a party? And I guess the people, we kind of know, the people. And it is, I guess, just a couple of things, because this is helping me to wrap my mind around, because with China, as with many understandings of the state and government, there's many complex layers to it. And I think the way that most people describe China and its state is a pyramid structure. But I don't know if that's actually the most accurate. Pyramid being top down, hierarchical. There's the standing committee, which Xi Jinping is a part of. There's seven members. Essentially, they represent the core leadership of the nation. But then there's also the political bureau, which is the 7 standing committee members and others. So I think it's like 18 others, right?
Mhm.
And so that's one layer. They represent that leadership of the Chinese state. Then there's the additional layer, which is the National People's Congress. This is about 3,000 members. There are individuals within that are members of the Communist Party of China, which is about 90 million, that has 90 million members. And I think there's questions about why they have 90 million members in the Communist Party of China, but I think that's a detour or less so the focus of this conversation. But there's the Communist Party of China, and I think contrary to misconceptions of China, there are also other parties in China. However, it is true that the core leadership of China is the Communist Party of China. But this National People's Congress, they're essentially that secondary layer or tertiary layer that writes laws and provides that foundational framework for governing the country. And so even with that National People's Congress, there's another layer or subcomponents to it. And this is the State Council, which enacts the policies of the leadership. And then it's also the presiding group of the various departments or governmental departments that administrate the affairs of the country, and then also in particular different provinces, localities. So that's kind of the administrative part to it. Then there's the military, and then there's the courts, which is that provides that legal framework for China. I go through that because there are parts to it that I don't even understand, or I don't understand. And in terms of how do decisions both flow down, but also upwards. Because it is a state with a leadership that has a vision that creates a vision that these different bodies execute upon. But at the same time, what is clear from this research is that there's also a bottoms-up approach, which is this vision and this leadership also is based on feedback from the people, based on experimentation of local governments. I think two things that support that or I guess three things, which is that for the Congress, a lot of it is based, or not the Congress, the party, the various bodies, is that it's what Zhang Wei actually talks about too, is this long tradition of meritocracy within China. The civil service examination system that was present like 1,000, 2,000 years ago, where much of the government officials were expected to pass civil service examination exams. And these exams were very rigorous, and where it's, I think, 7 to 9 nights where you're locked essentially in not cabinet, but essentially like an infrastructure, and you're taking these exams. The question about that is how has that been adapted for a modern society? And within the history of China, there has been this question of, a lot of those examinations were actually based on philosophy and literature, and mostly based on writing these essays. But with colonialism, with the West also coming in, the emperors actually had to reassess, is that sufficient? Is the more like essay-based, I guess today we would call humanities-based, sufficient for the ruling and governing of a nation? Or actually, do we also have to learn from the Western model, which is of science and I guess namely science at that time? And so that civil service examination has also been reformed over time to meet the needs as China has developed. But the reason why I say that is that that is a civilizational aspect of China's history that is brought in today, where many of these individuals in the party both have to go through, like they have to be individuals who are rigorously or have studied and have governed or had a resume of actually governing to ascend through the structure itself, the government itself. But the thing is that this is not just, as China has emphasized education, where, for example, 2 generations ago, literacy was high in China. People, probably the most of its extent to education was primary school. Now, education is compulsory to, I think it's 16, and actually there are many people who are going to higher education. And I think that's one of the problems that it's running into, which is that so many people are being educated right now, and there's not enough so-called, I guess, office jobs or jobs that are not more menial labor. But I say that to say that because you have a robust education system, naturally, children who are born to poor families, or even in cities that are not these top-tier cities, are able to become part of governing a people. So that's one piece. The other is polling. In free school, we've talked a lot about polling, Gallup, Ipsos, like how do you get a sense of what the people are thinking about? And do they want a highway built through their town? Do they, whatever it is, these polls. And one of the, I'm forgetting the name, but one of the polling systems, or one of the largest clients of these polls within China is the government at various levels, at the national level, at these local levels, to understand what the people's needs are. So that's 2. And then the third part is this both centralized but also decentralized governing system, where there are state meaning China, the top bodies of governance of the strategic directions of the nation, and these are represented through their 5-year plans, where, for example, a thing that most people may have heard is this investment in electric vehicles. But the thing is that a lot of these programs are actually based on experiment, meaning at the local levels, provincial levels, they're experimenting with how exactly to achieve these overall objectives of the nation. And I think lately there's been this report that's been circulating, I think on Twitter, in the intellectual spheres, which is entitled "The Rise of China's Electric Vehicle Industry: Strategic Alliances Between Local Governments and Private Capital." And I cite this as an example, and I mean, I don't know all the intricacies of how local loans are given to various manufacturers and factories and how all of that. But essentially what I did take away from this is that at the beginning of the development of the EV sector, there was state-owned enterprises or state-owned enterprises that were developing in EV. However, what's happened is that come from various provinces in China. What has happened is that actually these private companies have emerged in partnership with local governments. So this is your BYDs, this is your, I don't know, like all these other various electric vehicle companies. But the point of the article, and the point that I'm trying to make, is that there are certain guardrails in terms of what the nation is trying to achieve in 5 years, 10 years, so forth. And it's set forward, but it's also up to the local governments to experiment how these are achieved. And oftentimes it's that balance of the private sector, the local government, and then also the nation itself. Where am I? Yep, so I think that's one piece that we're trying to understand. But anyways, I say all this to say that there's a lot of complexity to it in terms of how is a state even conceptualized and actually built, implemented, but also going through changes. Because broad strokes, I had mentioned earlier, of like the period of Mao down to Xi Jinping, but it's clear that even now, the Chinese government or the Chinese state is still trying to figure out how is power centralized, where it should be centralized, and how much is it that private industry, local governments will experiment, compete for these local where their successes in local programs then be nationalized. And because they've seen it work in a smaller group or smaller body of individuals. One thing that I actually missed before is this question of the state. I think part of what we're trying to understand through the free school is like what actually even consists of the state. And maybe Doc, you can expand on this. I think part of the challenge is that there isn't or intellectuals, philosophers, and parties have been trying to understand or trying to make sense of what encompasses state. The reason is that, and part of this comes from, I think, as I was researching, is that there have been different definitions of the state. One that consistently came up was Max Weber, German sociologist or German philosopher, sociologist, and essentially his definition is that the state is the only entity that is authorized to use force. But that was his preliminary way of looking at what a state is. And if you can imagine, this is the possession of a military, ability to strip individuals of their rights, police force, so forth, right? But so that was like 1920s, 1919, 1920s. But now I think that has been insufficient as we've been talking about what is a civilizational state. I know Michelle talked, but I think that's why Michelle also had these different definitions as well, because I think most serious intellectuals are trying to grapple with this question of the state because of its relationships to the people, how it governs and runs society. There's another set of definitions that was pretty helpful for me to understand or better understand what is the state. And it comes from this philosopher or professor of political science at this university in Hong Kong. I will caveat that this guy basically used in the early 2000s to say the Chinese state is in a crisis. And I think that voice, which was much louder in the early 2000s, I think less so now in terms of, the Chinese state is about to collapse, it's in crisis, so forth. I think there still are some of those voices, but it's dwindled down over the past decade. And most have had to reckon with the fact that China is a serious nation, and it's not going to collapse so easily because of its relationship with the people, because of the competence and of the state. But the 6 dimensions that Professor Wang, which is this guy that I was mentioning, also got a PhD at Yale, is that he does incorporate the use of force from Max Weber, but he also has these 5 other dimensions, which is the ability to extract resources. So this is land, this is your taxes, this is forces of production, so forth. That's 2. Third is shaping national identity and this the unity of people through a common set of values and principles. And I think the way we've better framed that is, or Professor Zhang Wei has better framed, is the civilizational state, which is what is it that actually constitutes the Chinese people, the American people, and so forth. So that's the third. The fourth is the ability to regulate society and economy. This is your laws, your rules. Fifth is maintaining these state institutions that support the regulation of a nation. And this is like the various administrative bureaucracies, so forth. And then the sixth is the ability to distribute the resources. And so, like, imagine in the city, how much you're distributing to education, how much you're distributing to prisons, so forth. But that was helpful in terms of how essentially across these 6 dimensions, how is the Chinese state at these various levels, or which powers at these various levels of the Chinese state are responsible for. And so I think where I will probably end is now the changes that the Chinese state has had to go through. Because a lot of what we, obviously with Mao and then also to Xi Jinping, is that the institutions and the ideology has been taken from the Soviet Union, where even for example, the name of the Politburo is something that is adapted from the Soviet Union, where the different levels, such as the National People's Congress, the Central Committee, the State Council, also closely mirror those of the Soviet Union, where there's a Supreme Soviet, the Soviet Party Central Committee, and the Ministerial Council. The reason why I bring this up is that even as we're trying to understand the American situation, it's helpful to understand how the Chinese have not been copy and pasting essentially a model from the Soviet Union. Instead, it's had to take the best of those, but then adapt it to the Chinese civilization, to the Chinese people, and to the Chinese, or the needs of the Chinese people. And that has been clear through the various plenums that under the CPC leadership has gone through, particularly in, I think the last one was in 2024, where essentially the power of these different levels of the state had been redistributed. And one clear example in the research and is even Xi Jinping's like anti-corruption campaign, because previously where power had resided was in the local parties. And so individuals who were part of this disciplinary committee reported to the party official. And so the question is, okay, if you're reporting to this party official, then you can only look down. How are you going to say your boss is corrupt? And so power was essentially centralized in this national disciplinary committee. So now, okay, but that's just an example of how it's had to, the Chinese state has had to relook at its institutions, where power is centralized, so forth, to meet the needs of the nation. Now, the role of the people. I think I've spoken to like the polls, how individuals, no matter from what section of society, are able to rise, participate in governance, has been mentioned. But I think where I kind of am taking from our free school sociological method, and even your experiences in China, like supplementing this theory and ideology with also experiences too, is this question around freedoms. I think many people in the West often say, okay, in the United States, you can say whatever you want and nothing will happen to you, which I think one is not the accurate picture. But then it's oftentimes used against, for example, a place like China, where in China you can't say whatever, or you're certain of your freedoms are limited. And I think part of it is this concept of positive versus negative freedoms. Negative freedoms being freedoms from society, and then
From the state.
from the state, and then positive freedoms meaning freedoms to do or to make changes in society. There's various analyses of, okay, when you look at China and the Chinese people, are they high in negative freedoms, or are they high in positive freedoms, or are they low, so forth. And I actually think so the guy, his name is Eric Lee, he's also studies political science, that I've drawn much of this presentation from. He was saying that in China, you have high negative freedoms and low positive freedoms. Because and I actually would argue, which is that there's high negative freedoms and high positive freedoms. And the reason why I say that is because Eric was saying, I don't know this guy, but Eric is his name. But the reason why is basically he was saying in China, you have high negative freedoms because in your personal private lives, you can do whatever you want. You can date whoever you want. You can not wear clothes in your house. And this was the example that he used. You can not wear clothes in your house if you want. For the most part, if you're not disrupting society, you can do whatever you want. And so that's one piece. Then the other piece is the positive freedoms. He was arguing that there's low positive freedoms in China because you can't say whatever you want on the internet, meaning you're responsible for your words, and words do have implications for the governing of a society. But I think, as based on the earlier parts of the discussion, the freedom to change society, the freedom to have a state that is responsive to the needs of the people, I think China does perform highly, and that therefore I say it actually has high positive freedoms, where if there's a pothole, it gets fixed in a week or actually a couple of days. If there's whatever it is that's happening in society, what you see from the people is that they get fixed very quickly, and so people's needs are being met. And then the other piece is how that has been clear through, or not clear, at least I've had some sample of how do the people feel about this. And this is your ordinary, not your billionaires, not your whoever it is. How do the ordinary people who are, they can be at various levels of society, feel about their freedoms? Do they feel free? And so one anecdote is that I had asked my family members, hey, people like to say that the Chinese people are not free. Do you feel free? And they're like, I feel very free. For the most part, in general discourse, in among your friends, your family, so forth, you're able to talk about things just the way that, I don't know if it's just the way, but for the most part, you're able to have discourse. You're not being monitored, so on and so forth. But there are broader implications when you get on the internet, and it's open, and there are boundaries to what you can say. So, for example, most recently, the Chinese government essentially said, if you don't have a degree in medicine, in law, in finance, you're not allowed to provide advice on TikTok, on Instagram, so forth. And part of the rationale is that ordinary people will take advice from these various so-called snake oils, financial advice, and they end up either bankrupt or, losing money, paying for medicines that are actually snake oils, don't work. And that's a common thing. I have a roommate that his mom is in the snake oil thing. She's like, yeah, like there's like pyramid or Ponzi schemes where these snake oils are being sold, so on and so forth. But there are boundaries on the internet to what you can do. And so that's one piece. The other piece is freedom to do what, which is, I think through various experiences of free school members, you're able to go out late at night and there's still a lively nightlife. There are old people in parks dancing, there are young children in parks playing with their friends, so on and so forth. Whereas I would argue in the United States, or at least in a city like Philadelphia, you don't have that freedom. Then the other thing is that my father's aunt, she used to work at the hotels for the military, meaning when various members of the army go to various cities, they would stay at these army, what's it called again? Army hotels. She was the front desk person for a long time. What's happened recently is that her passport was taken. And her passport was taken because essentially China does see that its military affairs and our military affairs, how it's planning, so on and so forth, are top secret. And part of its fear is that those would be leaked out. Is she unhappy about this? Yes. She's not happy that she can't go to Egypt because my dad just went to Egypt and was like, we should go to Egypt because you can see land, mountains, water, blah, blah, blah. She's not happy about it. But is it a big thing that because of it, she's like, oh, the government sucks or the state sucks? No. I think it is part of an inconvenience where she's like, okay, now I can't go outside of China. But for the most part, she's still able to travel. Not for the most part. She is still able to travel in China, go to different cities, have different experiences, so on and so forth. But I mentioned that because I think people would see the example of that and say China is not a free society. But in governing, I think she also understands that there are certain restrictions that are for the benefit of a society. And I think part of it is that she's also just waiting where things will relax and she can go to wherever she wants in the world, whatever it is. But the other part is that as I was talking to her, she also she was like, no, like from her generations or from our parents' generation, they recognize how much has changed for the benefit of the people. Right. She was saying how in terms of infrastructure, in terms of healthcare, in terms of employment, retirement benefits, so on and so forth. She's very secure in being able to live, afford bills, engage in activities, so on and so forth. And she has recognized how far it's come from when she was growing up. And that is all due to the Chinese state. And so I think with that, I'm not sure how quite to end, but I think a huge part of that is that in trying to understand the Chinese state, the Chinese people, there are large lessons for the American state and its relationship to the people, to be responsive to the needs of the people. What is required of a state and its governing bodies, both in its understanding of the people and its relationship to the people, but how do you actually run a country? In China, it's 1.3 billion people, 1.4 billion people. In the United States, it's 300 million, or I don't know, whatever, like 330 million people. Those are complex issues. That's a complex task, and it requires a serious understanding of different models that have worked in the world, and parts that could be adapted for our situation, but also would require an understanding of American history and civilized, or I guess specifically what we're saying is that is Black civilization. Yeah.
I said one question. No,
Can I
wait a minute, hold it, not yet. Go ahead.
Well, I really liked it surprised me, but I really liked how you brought in the question of freedoms, and it helped me even make sense of some of how I'd been thinking about this. So what I wanted to say is kind of responding to your earlier point. I really feel that the American people are more ready than they ever have been to embrace the full meaning of China for America, and even with the crisis of the U.S. state being what it is, first it uniting the American people in unforeseen ways, but I think also pressure testing every concept that we have had of democracy, the state, freedom. And just one small example is like when Albert and I eat sandwiches in free school, we go to this butcher shop near our house to get sliced meats. And when I went last week, like he was like, "Where have you been?" And I was like, "Oh, I was in China, my butcher." And he said, "Can you just tell me one thing that you really loved the most? Eating, you know, because he loves food." And I thought about it, and I spent we spent most of our time in Beijing, which is where Emily's family is from. And Emily would always say like, "Oh, Northerners eat wheat and Southerners eat rice." And I hadn't even thought about that. But I really fell in love with, you know, something that many of us have eaten, but it's just a steamed bun. It's called mantou. And like, there's plain steamed buns, and then there's steamed buns filled with like red bean. And you can get some of that in the US. But in Beijing, it was just so staggering because like every day, like I would go out in the morning while Albert was still getting ready. And then I'd come home with like 4 to 6 steamed buns. And then Albert would be like, "Oh, like why did you get so many?" Because there's different types. There's one with like herbal greens. There's one with black sesame filled, one with black sesame rolled, black sesame with walnuts, black sesame with red dates with red bean with purple rice, like all these like permutations and combinations of like mantou. And so I just gave that to my butcher as one example. And I love the way he framed it back to me, where he was like, "I wish I could be one of those bakers, because to be honest, all I want to do is sell meat and maybe make some charcuterie for people, and for that to be enough. But my business can't survive. I have to market. I have to do dinners, expensive dinners for, you know, wealthy clients." And he was like, you know, how I interpreted what he was saying is, I want a state of the whole people. I want to live in a society where the craftsperson has a place.
Right.
And I literally saw deindustrialization in what he was saying, because he's white. So he comes out of kind of that artisan tradition. Like, I just want to do my thing, and I want to do it well. I want to be a baker. I want to be a butcher. I want to be a welder. And so that's kind of how I interpret some of what Alice is saying, is we see the state of the people, the whole people in the concrete, through some of what we see in China. And then he himself, my butcher, brought up the question of freedom, where he was like, you know, I'm sitting here basically broke, asking myself, like, what does this propaganda mean if I possess these so-called freedoms that, frankly, I'm not quite sure how to use? And he just like, honestly, like, I couldn't leave that butcher shop because I was like stressed and I actually had stuff to do, but he just like kept asking so many questions about China. And he was like, if I can get my wife to look past the propaganda she swallowed, like, I would love to go.
Yeah.
But like, it's just like new consciousness, you know, young, because I spoke with many people about China since I got back. Young, old, white, black, children of immigrants. Everyone has something to say, and they are all new reflections that I've never heard before, that reflects our changing concept of the American domestic situation. But just again, like, I really feel that people are developing their vision of what a state of the whole people would look like by seeing China's concrete achievements. And I was so impressed by how quickly he made that connection, you know. He was like, they have made a place for that person in society that I wish I could occupy. Yeah, and then we talked about it, you know.
Yeah,
Yes.
just one anecdote I want to add to what you're saying is I had the same experience where I felt less shy to talk to some of my union members about China when I came back in February. And some of it was also shaped by the fact that my family had to make the difficult decision to put my grandfather, he was living by himself, he's 97, he lives by himself in his own apartment with no elevator. And so he needed full-time care, so he made this difficult decision to put him in a nursing home in China. And I work with a lot of nursing home workers in the US. And so it's the first time I'm so familiar with the healthcare system in the US. and the nursing home system in particular. And it was the first time I got an insider look at the nursing home system in China. You know, this broad need for elder care in two different societies. And it's not just about society, but then I got an inside look at also the state, but also theories of life and governance, where I was telling my two union members, one was, and they're both white, like, and I'm not talking about like middle class white, I'm talking about like pencil tucky white. Like, and I was telling them, because they were like, oh, how was your time off, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, actually, I was taking care of my grandfather. I had to put him in a nursing home. And immediately they were like, oh, I'm so sorry. But I said, no, actually, I think he's going to be better there. And the big thing in nursing facilities is ratios. How many caregivers, how many nurses, nursing aides are there per residents, per people who need care? And I was like, actually, the ratio at my grandfather's nursing home is 1-to-1.
Whoa.
One caregiver to one resident. It's 1-to-1. And because it's also based on acuity of care. So like for my grandfather, who has basically dementia at this point, he will have 1-to-1, and sometimes it's two caregivers per one person, my grandfather. And the ratio in Pennsylvania is something like 20-1.
Oh, wow.
One caregiver, and the actual standards are supposed to be 1-to-10, 1-to-12, which is already too much. One caregiver for 12 people who are waiting for help to use the restroom. That's the level of care. And it was so interesting because this white union member was like, she said to me, wow, I'm living in the wrong country. And these are the people who mainstream media are like called deplorables. These are the so-called deplorables. These are the people who are seen as undereducated, dumb, or vote against their own interests, and who you'd assume are racist and all this stuff. And she was just like, I'm living in the wrong country. Sign me up. I need to move to China. And then the other union member I talked to, she said, can you ask the Chinese government to come save us? She was like, oh, we need the Chinese government to come save us. And it's just, I mean, these are like not even Black members, union members, who I tend to feel like have more consciousness, more open, less judgmental. Like, and that's just another example of what Michelle was saying about these are times of changing consciousness of the American people. But the reason why this discussion is so valuable to talk about even theories, both theories of the Chinese state, how do the Chinese people, Chinese intellectuals, Chinese government officials understand democracy or understand like what defines the state, the relationship between the state and the people, both theoretically and concretely in practice, is so valuable because like you're so right. It brings up, this is the exact type of conversation I feel like people in Philly are yearning to have. The people in Philly are yearning to have a conversation of governance. Who's really governing? This is a city this is a city that is an ungovernable city. No one is being governed. And then in fact, that is the issue. You have a bunch of play actors in a political theater of City Hall, not governing at all. And but they just show up with their social media staff and take photos of them talking about XYZ buzzwords in XYZ communities. But everyone can feel this is a city without governance. I mean, that's what people yearn for. So I thought that was so funny, especially when that union member was like, oh man, I hope the Chinese government saves us.
Well, actually, in response, just building on something you were saying about like elderly care, is that a couple of years ago, there were instances of elderly abuse at some of these care centers. And what had happened is that essentially people were afraid then to send their elderly parents, grandparents to these centers. And essentially in China. And so I think that was also the question of like surveillance. I guess it's been brought up too, of like misconceptions of like a surveillance state too. People know this was happening. Now, I don't know about your grandfather's facility, but these places have cameras to monitor like if the elderly are being abused. And nowadays there's less of that stigma because that issue has been addressed. But the other part is that there are these broad laws that the state has, but then, meaning the governing state has, but then oftentimes it has to go through essentially local participation and feedback. Because domestic abuse was also another issue that was like of the past decade or so. And so there are laws passed, but then part of the conversation with people in various localities were saying it's not just husband against wife, but it's also young people against elderly people. And so that was adopted into that broader law.
Say law.
Yeah, to not, that it's illegal to abuse, like domestically abuse either your wife, your husband, your parents, whatever it was. And I guess I just mentioned that both on the elderly piece and also this question of democracy, which is like how is the state actually responsive to the emerging needs of the people as society evolves?
I just,
Yeah,
I just remembered, because of what Emily said, that there was an article in Bloomberg a couple of days ago, which was highlighting how more and more foreigners are traveling to China for life-saving medicine.
Oh, wow.
Because it is cheaper, and the part that really got to me is more readily available. Everybody, I think, knows about, yes, the healthcare system is broken here, and with insurance and everything, everything is very unaffordable in terms of healthcare. But the ready availability is what really struck me, that the Chinese medical system makes it so that life-saving medication, life-saving treatments are readily available for those who need it, and even are available for people who are coming from abroad. And that, I was really struck by that, and it made me think about just the concept of a social contract between the state and the Chinese people. Because if we think about how the Chinese people looks at its people, and how, say, for example, the Indian state looks at its people. I mean, I'm saying this because I think a few days ago, the US attacked some Indian tankers, and 3 Indian Navy officers died. And I was very disappointed with the response of the Indian state, and that if you contrast that with what happened like back in the end of the 20th century, I think 1998 or 1999, there were US missile strikes in the Belgrade embassy, and 3 Chinese journalists died. And there were state-sponsored protests in the cities, and like communication between Washington and China completely broke down for a few years. And that tells me how much the Chinese state cares about its people, because it cares about upholding the social contract that it has forged. And the way that Michelle sort of laid out the civilizational state of China, like I'm beginning to look at all of this through a civilizational lens, that you can feel that your utmost responsibility is the upholding of the social contract because you look at it from a civilizational lens. Like legitimate political authority, I think this is Rousseau, like legitimate political authority comes from the general will of the people.
General will, yes.
And I think that no modern state kind of exemplifies that as much as I see in China. Like everything that China does, even what you were saying about the freedoms of individual people, it comes from that. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about, should you be allowed to do whatever you want regardless of the consequences? And is that true freedom? Does that mean that you're truly free? And I think that in a way, it matters how you look at boundaries or restrictions. Are all boundaries and all restrictions bad? Or is everything that is done to stop you from harming society bad because you're encroaching upon your individual liberties? I don't think so. And the Chinese state, the example that you gave about you can't have just random people giving you medical advice. That's dangerous for people. But you do have that kind of freedom here, and you contrast that with the actual medical system that exists in the country, and you see a very, very deep divide. Like, why are people going on TikTok to ask for medical advice? Like, why are doctors so inaccessible? Why are they acting as these gatekeepers instead of actually like providing people with the knowledge that they need? Yeah, I think this conversation really made me think of a lot, especially I think Michelle, Jahan, Eddie, and I have been working on this prison reform report, and as part of that, we were looking at like a comparison between the U.S. and China in terms of their prison populations as well. How much China invests in prisons and how much China invests in education versus the same metrics for the US. And what we found was that, okay, you have China, which is supposedly an authoritarian state. They are supposed to be putting people into prisons all the time. But the US has a 5-time greater incarceration rate than China. And if you look at the amount of money that is being put into the prison system versus the education system, there's, a difference between heaven and hell, between those two, between the priorities of the state, I would say. Whereas in China, there has been a consistent increase in the amount of money that they have put into educating their youth. Whereas their investment in corrections has been pretty constant across a long period of time. I think the highest increase, which is still not comparable to the US, was when Xi Jinping started his anti-corruption drive, and then they built a few new prisons after like 20-40 years. And so, all of this is to say is, I feel like I'm looking at this through the state's commitment to the people, and that is a civilizational stance. I think about Iran when I think about China. Yeah. I think about Black America when I think about China.
I just have one question. Wait a minute, John. Wait a minute. This is very profound discussion, and I agree with Emily and everyone that this is a discussion that is appropriate for this 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And, just your stories about your co-workers, poor people, poor white people who we would assume don't have the same level of general understanding, let us say, as Black folk, but this is across the board where the people of the United States look upon China in a realistic way as a well-governed nation that is constantly progressing.
Right.
Well, that's true. These facts cannot be hidden any longer. And one thing I was hoping we would discuss more is the state's commitment to children, the safety of children, the well-being of children, the education of children, and any comparison between China and the United States is so, the United States is so abysmally failing children. And you don't have to be a social scientist Dwight and I were driving around certain neighborhoods, especially black neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And what we saw was horrifying. To allow children to live in what we call neighborhoods. Some of the neighborhoods of Philadelphia is a crime against children. To know that children are not being educated, that children are vulnerable to every kind of criminal. This is horrifying, and it continues to get worse. But I'm always so uplifted when I hear you all talk, because it's not like a Western journalist, or really, to tell you the truth, a white journalist, or a paid-off Chinese journalist, what we normally call an Uncle Tom journalist, Chinese Uncle Tom or bootlicker. We're talking about, like, I know Alice goes so often with her father, and, you know, I usually say that Alice brings stories back from the hood.
No, that's not true.
Oh, you're not in the hood?
No.
That's what I'm trying. I asked Nori, do they have a hood in Seoul? Y'all don't have a hood over there?
No.
I'm sorry. But they seem to be so grassroots.
No.
And so, but when you tell me these stories, that, like when you say your father goes there, and he's a big man, you know, passing out a couple.
That's still true, yeah. But no, we're not in the hood. But I don't feel like there is a hood in China.
This is interesting, you know. But
It's just one hood.
the whole country is a hood. We're all in the hood. But it's always so impressive whenever you come back, and now for Albert and Michelle to come back, and the same enthusiasm and excitement about China. You know, and now the story about your grandfather and so on. These are moving stories of real life people, of real life experiences, unfiltered through, if you don't mind me saying, the white man's media. And let's be real clear about this. White elites in the United States are jealous of China. And when they see all these Chinese students, either the children of immigrants or, you know, students coming over here that be educated, like at NYU, like at Penn, and all of these Chinese overachieving, they know the time of day it is. But besides, I'm always interested in Alice's study of the Chinese state, the Chinese party, and their relationship to this 1.5, 1.4 billion people. And that's a miracle in itself, that this huge population is so well governed.
Right.
There is not a crisis of governance as there is here. There is a crisis of governance that we're always thinking about: when will the government collapse? Is this form of government sustainable? So the question is, how did that become possible? The system of governance. Given that in the 1960s, for almost a decade, the country was thrown into turmoil. And this is kind of where I'm a little bit critical of Professor Weiwei's analysis. I don't think he gives enough credit to Deng Xiaoping and now Xi Jinping's restoration of civil society in China. That it was destroyed. That's I get from Emily's parents' narrative. Could I say this, Emily? It was so severe that I think that your mother has never reconciled with China. Is that fair? You know what I'm saying? She went through the Cultural Revolution. And, you know, I think she feels that her youth was stolen in that period. So there were millions of young people who were thrown into turmoil. And here we get Deng Xiaoping, who restores or begins a process of the restoration of society. And how was this done? That's why I would say the Chinese state is still in process of definition and so on. It's not complete yet. So if you say the civilization state, that's still, well, what is it? You know? Or you say the state of the whole people, which is a big ideological development, given that now in the Cultural Revolution, people attack the concept of the state of the whole people. But now, I think that's what Deng and now Xi Jinping have reestablished. But to reestablish Chinese society, they had to rebuild the Communist Party of China. I've been always question mark, how do you have a 95 million person Communist Party? What kind of party is this? Is this a administrative arm of the state?
Yeah.
And I think it does play that role. But the party itself is an interesting phenomenon in modern history, the Communist Party of China, because it is not one thing. And it is very hierarchical, as I think you, Alice, pointed out, with this standing committee of the Politburo, and then the Central Committee, of which the Politburo is the leading body of the Central Committee, and the central decision makers between the Congresses of the Communist Party is the Politburo in conjunction with its standing committee. Now, that's a lot to wrap your head around, because it is so opposite to bourgeois liberal concepts of governance. China is not governed on the basis of bourgeois liberal concepts that go back to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Especially we're talking about the English tradition. You couldn't govern China on that basis. A two-party system of governance and rule wouldn't work for China. And it barely works for Iran. They might not have it after this war. Because, I don't get into that. But to have such a party with that hierarchy that everybody looks to, well, the Central Committee, I don't know how many members they have of the Central Committee, but then the Politburo and the Standing Committee. That is, in effect, the leading body of the state, not the whole Communist Party. That group is the leading body of the state, okay? A lot of responsibility is on their shoulders. If they mess up, it could be catastrophic. You know what I'm saying? Because such a small group of people carry such responsibility. And that is the amazing thing about China. But then, to win a broad ideological consensus of the whole Communist Party, 95 million people. That's not just because the Standing Committee or the Politburo or the Central Committee said X, Y, and Z. That is the everyday, day-to-day struggle to win the rank and file and different levels of the party to a single purpose, be it the 5-year plan, be it the education budget, whatever. That is a lot. And it has to be one. And there has to be, this is where the democracy thing is so important, discussion. Constant discussion, which means to be a party member means that you have to have a certain level of education and consciousness above the ordinary Chinese person. Now, what I believe, and I can only say this, I'm just deductively, civil society, which was already destroyed with the Civil War, with the Japanese occupation. To restore civil society, they did it on the basis of the Communist Party's leadership at the grassroots level. That becomes civil society. Art, culture, child care, I mean, whatever. Okay, my last point is this, the state and the party. We have no way of imagining this in our culture and our tradition. What is that like? How do the Chinese wrap their head around it? That, first of all, we are a society run pretty much and governed by the leadership of a communist party, okay? Who believes in democracy, but not in civil liberties the way it is stated here. And there is a difference between democracy, people's democracy, and, quote, civil liberties. And then the next question, and I'll just end on this, and I know this is what Alice has always, the question of fairness. Do Chinese ordinary people believe that their society is a fair society? So what I get from you all is that most people that you all know would say, yes, it is fair. In other words, if a black kid is killed by a grocer, shot dead, that grocer is not going to be found not guilty. You know, and where then you get an entire black community which always feels that we live in an unjust society. 40-some million people say this is unjust. Is there an equivalent group in Chinese society that would say that? I don't think so, even among Uyghurs. There is a sense that as the country gets wealthier, the wealth of the country is always being redistributed broadly. So I think even though we might not know, and I don't know that there have been adequate studies of the Chinese system, the relationship of party to state and party to people and state to people, even though we don't know everything, I think there is certain evidence that, one, Chinese is one of the most well-governed societies in the world, certainly better than the United States. The United States is one of the most poorly governed countries in the world. China is better governed than Great Britain. China is better governed than most of the Western European countries, out of which came bourgeois liberalism and, quote, bourgeois democracy. China is better governed. The people feel that the government is governing on their behalf. Take the same poll in the United States. 70% of American people say the government is not governing on their behalf. Come to Philadelphia, you might probably get 100% of the people that say this is a badly governed city. So I think if we look at it like this, we're seeing, and indeed I agree with you, it is the state of the whole people. It is not a dictatorship of the proletariat. Hopefully, you know, and I agree with you, in every dimension, the Martin Luther King vision, the beloved community, community as the basis of governance rather than hierarchy. I think I agree with you. We're looking at something that is similar to King and Du Bois. You know, when Du Bois went there, China was still in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Today, that is not the case. It's the state of the whole people. Could we go from the dictatorship of a small capitalist class to a state of the whole people. That's what we want, but what we want might not always be what happens. Go ahead.
I just had a question about, you had mentioned the civil service exams determine whether someone can go into that profession. Also, in terms of higher education, I was told they have like a national lottery exam they have to take to go into higher education. If you don't pass those exams, does the state assign people jobs? And if you have so many people, if they can't pass the civil service exam or the exam to go to higher education, I was told the state will assign them a job to do. Or because they would be stuck, because they can't go into certain things because they can't
Let
pass
Alice
the exam.
answer your question. Go ahead, Alice, if you can.
I don't know, but I don't know the answer. But I think the entrance exam is something that's not just unique to the United States. I mean, unique to China, because it's a modern invention, which is this comprehensive national exam to get into higher education. I mean, you see that in the United States, you have to pass the SATs to go to whatever college you want to go to. So that's not unique to China. I think in terms of job placements, I don't know about that.
But it's not like the SAT is determined by how high you score in terms of what college you can go to. But the SAT is not like pass fail, where if you fail or you get a low score, you can't go to college at all. Whereas in the Chinese system is one in which if you fail, like they won't allow you to go further.
Wait a minute, John. Wait a minute. You're making an assertion about the Chinese system. On what evidence do you make that claim that if you don't, quote, pass the civil service exam, you left out? I mean, this is
on the fact if you're dealing with an authoritarian system.
Well, hold it. Wait a minute. First of all, well, that's an assumption. Wait, hold it. See, let me get one thing straight. You can come in here every week and repeat something you heard in the white media by people. Wait a minute, hold it. Hey, John. Wait a minute. Hey, I can handle this. Let me say this. Every week you can come in here with some garbage out of the sewer of the white media.
I'm not getting my information.
Yes, you are. What you know about an authoritarian government in China? Where did you get that from?
So you're talking to an adult. You're not talking to a child.
Well, I'm talking to
so like
I'll talk to you like I talk to an adult. And I'll tell you this. I'm gonna tell you this. Maybe no. I'm gonna tell you this. I think you should stop coming here. I would propose that you not come to the Saturday Free School because you do not come to contribute anything positive. And I'll talk to you. I'm going to talk. No, you're not. And I would suggest, matter of fact, I will demand that you stop coming here because you want to take advantage of our goodwill. No. Well, could I ask, don't come back.
Right,
anybody else? No.
I won't come back.
Good.
Good.
And we will not miss you. We will not. No. Well, don't come back. You're not asking simple questions. Every time you come here.
I was trying to learn something.
No, well, don't come, brother, please. Don't come back.
All right, fine. I won't come back.
All right, let's move on. And I apologize to the rest of y'all, but we've been doing this for 15 years. We fight to maintain a certain standard of respect. And no, you're not. Look, hey, John, don't come back. You're not welcome here.
I'm just asking a question. I'm trying to learn something like anybody else.
Excuse me, y'all. I know y'all don't like me.
I don't know why you coming at me.
Well, you'll find out. Think about it.
Find out what?
Okay.
I mean, it sounds like you were trying to threaten me, sir. I mean, what's up with that? Like it sounds like you're trying to threaten somebody. What's up with that, sir? I don't understand that at all. I'm just trying to learn something.
Yeah, no.
Like when I first came here, I said I was trying to learn something. That's the reason why I came.
Who's the
Then
next?
I wasn't able to come every week. I was making comments over the internet.
Okay. Who's the
But
next?
if I come as a person who's a stranger to you, I'm just trying to learn something.
Okay.
But then to insult me and attack me, that's completely uncalled for. But like I told you before, you're dealing with a full-grown adult. You're not talking to a child, buddy. I'm telling you right now.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one thing.
Go ahead, Samir.
Well, I think,
Let this brother over here speak.
well, I had,
Talking a lot of shit, man. That's crazy.
I think that's fine that we can talk shit around this table. I had some remarks that were planned that were like this before, you guys had your, interaction. I want to say we're all, grown men around the table. But we need to have a productive conversation. And that means, not speaking over each other and not, speaking to each other disrespectfully. I'm used to a circular situation because I went to a Quaker school, kindergarten to 13, so I'm comfortable like this. I think that other people who might have gone to a bigger school, they're used to hiding the lecture. I also, was in a, Western, Maoist formation. And, the Maoist tradition, you have criticism, self-criticism sessions. And so that was my entry into politics. So I'm not unused to hostile political situations. And, I was talking to Jahan this past week, and, I told him I miss the old free school when we could, talk to each other more directly. And I was telling him, my new slogan that I'm going into preschool with is, make preschool nasty again. Because I could make it nasty again, because, you weren't here for the old preschool. There's been many iterations of preschool. There's some people in the old preschool who weren't so nice. I'm not gonna name any names because they might still be hating from afar. But, there's some, mean people in preschool. And, I think I miss that preschool because, like I said in the beginning, I'm used to, circular table discussion. And it's, something I voluntarily come back to. But the point is, it needs to be, one thing here, which I think it's okay to be nasty with each other. This group needs to be more politically direct. I don't wanna sit here and, have a pro-China session love fest either, I can just go to Twitter and, find someone to compliment China. I think there are legitimate, criticisms of China, like the Deng Xiaoping period when, he invaded Vietnam, when, India was invaded, the way that China behaved around Afghanistan. And it was, a miraculous industrialization of a developing country, but it was supported by the Soviet Union to do so, and the Soviet Union supported China in entering the UN, in entering the World Trade Organization. The Korean War would not have happened if the Soviet Union was not boycotting the UN at that time for the sake of China. And, China would not have entered, the World Trade Organization without positioning itself against the Soviet Union. Anyway, I don't want to get into a history lesson, but my uncle lives in China and he is from India, but he's a very cosmopolitan guy. He moved to London, he moved to the Middle East for a little bit, and he found his home in China. And what he said about China when he first came to America was two things. One, that they've had 100 years of oppression, and now they'll have 100 years of prosperity. And then the other thing, he said was, in China, they say, in America, you can change the party, but you cannot change the policy. But in China, you can change the policy, but you can't change the party. And, I guess where I'll conclude is, I think that saying is first of all, it's in my favorite, poetic positioning. I forget what that's called. But it's also, you know, what it's saying is that China is not just, you know, there's the chaos. I'm a big fan of Mao Zedong and what he did. And obviously I don't, you know, believe the lies that he was trying to kill, you know, millions of, you know, Chinese people. And that's ridiculous. And, you know, if you actually read what he wrote, you know, what I was exposed to that made me so convinced to be a communist was that actually he really deeply cared about the Chinese people and their liberation and their democracy and their, you know, struggle for freedom. But he was, you know, chaos. He was against the Confucian system. And Deng Xiaoping brought China, you know, more to order, more back to, you know, out of the Cultural Revolution. And, you know, Xi Jinping's advancement has been to hold these two parts of China together, to have the revolutionary period and the civilizational, at the civilizational Confucius worldview, and but not to do what the Soviet Union did with Stalin and those periods, not to do what the Soviet Union did with Lenin. I think what you were saying, Michelle, was what makes China so revolutionary in this period. Like, what does revolutionary mean today? And it's more closer to what Fidel conceived of governance, of building society for children. And then, yeah, lastly, I wanted to say was, you know, I think we also need to take a step back because we've been talking about China for a very long time in the free school. You know, we had a whole conference about it, and so we sort of say things that are just assumed. But so I wanted to repeat one of those things. It's just assumed that you know, the Chinese, they had their revolution, and then the civil war with the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, and their revolution was not the American Revolution. It doesn't need to have the same values, like a right to property or a right to freedom of speech or a right to no quartering. That was not what the Chinese people needed for themselves at that time. They were trying to escape feudalism. And so their revolution had values of land reform, of a state to defend the people and not to be oppressed. And they're so-called Marxists who will say, well, you know, China doesn't deserve, you know, to have a revolution. We need to look at the French Revolution. We need to look at the American Revolution. Well, the French Revolution led to Bonaparte, and the American Revolution led to the American state today, which is the most violent state, which is the most powerful surveillance state to ever exist in the history of humanity. But that doesn't mean we reject the American Revolution or the French Revolution. But there's a double standard when it comes to the Russian and Chinese revolutions, and that's because those are non-white revolutions. And those people they don't have the right to revolution. They don't have the right, you know, to determine their destiny. That is the underlying assumption.
I kind of want to just go off of what you're saying because it reminds me of what Du Bois writes in his China and Africa speech. There's this little section that stuck out to me, which is the essence of the revolution in the Soviet Union and China and in all the Iron Curtain nations is not the violence that accompanied the change. No more than the starvation at Valley Forge was the essence of the American Revolution against Britain. The real revolution is the acceptance on the part of the nation of the fact that hereafter, the main object of the nation is the welfare of the mass of the people and not of the lucky few. So I just feel like what you said just reminded me of what Du Bois had seen too, of the true revolutionary essence of the Chinese people. That it wasn't the violence, but rather the uplifting of the people, like what you said.
I'm just curious, what did Du Bois say that?
This was, in 1959, Du Bois celebrated his 91st birthday in Beijing, at Beijing University.
And I think it's just, I think it's not just a matter of being like, oh, it would be nice to have a revolution with these values. We can go back and read Du Bois, you know, is saying this about, you know, the Chinese Revolution that I'm witnessing here is connected to the American Revolution, and I will make that argument. And there is a concerted effort to change what Du Bois said to be, oh, Du Bois is an abolitionist. Du Bois, he said all these things about class and race and footnote. But what we're talking about is not just like we're academically creating, but we're using your experience in China, relating it to what Du Bois sees and writes in China. And Shantanu and Alice and I have been discussing Ramesh Chandra, and so what's the importance of Ramesh Chandra? Like, there is no Taylor Branch history for Ramesh. I was looking into the Chinese general Lin Bao. It's disputed. Was he on the side of the Soviet Union, or was he on the side of the Maoists and the Gang of Four? It's not really known. And there's a public, what he says publicly, and then there's what his wife says about what he said privately. We don't know what political lines these people upheld, and it's a more challenging task. But I think the important thing about Ramesh and people like Henry Winston was when it was easy to be a liberal, when it was possible. Now when you're a liberal, there's no future for you. This is neoliberalism, the end of liberalism. It's AI or bust. You got to go home now. But back then it was easy to be a liberal because there was JFK. But what convinced these two men, Ramesh and Winston, to say no? I stand with the Soviet Union. I stand for peace. What gave them that courage? What did they see? What did they think? And how we don't have that history of how did they develop ideologically, because they weren't key people, but they were part of the cadre.
Well, I feel like part of what I was thinking about was, Michelle, like when you first started and like framing the conversation, basically like why even are we interested in China, and specifically like how it relates to the crisis in America. And I feel like the thing is that one, it's important to be able to pierce through the propaganda that has been told to Americans about China. And I feel like in some ways the crisis in our country is so great that the American people, and us in particular, we're searching for alternatives. Like we actually want to understand a theory of governance. And I don't think we need to approach it dogmatically of like, oh, we've identified something else and it must be it. But I think it's actually trying to contribute new ideas and new understanding to find a new way of doing things like for America and for us. And so I feel like this thing of seeing China as a mirror of like two super large countries in landmass and in population, and asking what actually is the theory of governance. And then can we evaluate whether it works, like whether the people are governed, whether the quality of life is improving, and then asking what do we learn about the theory of governance from the actual objective, like, I guess, consequences or the lives of the people. And I feel like that's where the anecdotes or the actual experiences that you guys are describing and your interactions with the Chinese people and your assessment of their consciousness like becomes important. And I was thinking about it too, because China and America, like those are two, like, I mean, they are like the two countries that I feel like are on the minds of the people of the world. But I feel like for me, it's also, this conversation has helped me to even like process or think about Korea, because I had also just come back from Korea. And in some ways, every country in some ways I think does have to basically ideologically reckon with and politically understand like what is China, what is America, and which country like do we see ourselves in, which country do we want to learn from or like even identify with, and which of those countries basically like marks the future or represents something for the future or for like the good of the people. And I say that because Korea in some ways is caught between China and the US. And it's not a big country, it's a very small country. And it was interesting because when we were there, the elections were happening, and Korea is like basically a two-party system, like the US. It's not like locked in two parties, like the parties actually change names a lot, but basically there is like a liberal, like left wing, and then there's a right wing. And it's really interesting because the right wing has become like, I think, pretty inspired by like Trump and MAGA. But in some ways, like they are the party of like, we only want individual freedom. We do not care about like the welfare of the majority of society. We believe that people have the right to make money. Like that's what matters. And that's what the definition of freedom is. And they're also very anti-communist. And so it's really clear that basically like with the Korean War and with the way that the US has basically like neo-colonized Korea, it affects the governance of the country and it affects the ideas even of like what you're interested in, what you think is even good, or how the country should be run. And it's interesting because the right wing it's like extremely anti-communist. And rather than I think operating on a sense of logic of like, this policy is good because it will help this many people, or it will provide opportunities for this many people. Rather, the justification is like, this policy is unacceptable because it will bring us closer to China, and we're not communist. Like, how can you be close to communism? And yeah, like I think that is just important to consider, that all of these ideas that we're talking about actually really matter for like even the theory of like, what is a country supposed to be? What is its responsibility to its people? And on the one hand, you can see the very negative influence, I think, of America, which is not even, I think, based on the reality of the American people. But in some ways, like the right wing in Korea sees MAGA or sees certain aspects of Trump. And like, I feel like they lean more towards the spectacle or the thing of like, oh, like we don't respect anything. We just do what we want because that's what freedom means. But then on the other hand, I feel like the crisis in Korea is not as deep as it is in the US. And in some ways, I think it is because of kind of a civilizational like grounding, where there is still an assumption that society, like that there is a social contract, or that the state has a responsibility to govern. And I feel like you see that in the investments in infrastructure, like the fact that like there is safety. Like when you describe being able to just go around late at night and there are public parks, and it's assumed that the parks are for the people, and families go on late night walks, you bike along the trails, and even in like this very large city of Seoul, like it's assumed that people have a right to access nature or to access like their own city. And so I think just like basic like assumptions of governance. And I think that civilizational element is really important too, because Korea also has like had the history of the civil service exam, where it was actually like somewhat democratic, where yes, it was like only wealthy families or like certain families could have the resources, I feel like, to generally do well in the civil service exams, but it was not blocked by class. It was open to anybody who actually wanted to like study. And you didn't have to be like basically of a certain aristocratic class to be part of the governance. And yeah, I feel like similarly, even the concept of like a college entrance exam, I feel like is meant to be more meritocratic than the American system, where the American concept is like, oh, like colleges will evaluate you based on how special of a person you are, plus your SAT scores. And so if you're really good at horseback riding or like hockey, then you deserve to be in college. Whereas in Korea, and I feel like in China, it's like, why do we care if you're good at horseback riding? We care if like you're good at math, if you want to like study math in college. And so I feel like the premise that actually it is meant to be equalizing, and it's not perfect, but there is like a theory behind it, that it should be a fair evaluation based on something that everybody goes through and everybody does.
The origins of the examination system go back pre-modernity.
Like, and the origin of that, like, bureaucratic exam and civil service and governance, I think does go back basically 1,000 years. And yeah, and I feel like in some ways, part of what we're dealing with today is the question of like modernity in the 21st century, where in some ways I think I see the 1800s and like the 19th century, like sort of including the American Revolution, as basically a time when there is a rise of like liberalism, like Samir was saying, where there's a Western system of like a new state that arises in Europe. And that becomes sort of the model that the world like learns from in the 19th century. And then with the 20th century, I feel like there's on the one hand a lot of turbulence, because there's the national liberation movements and these new countries become freed. But then it's still basically it needs to counter a prevailing system of like, let's have a Supreme Court, let's have like these laws, let's have constitutions. And that's still the framework. But I feel like in the 21st century, in the way that you're describing like Zhang Weiwei and China's like increased confidence in itself, I feel like the 21st century is the question of, can there be a modern state that recognizes and respects in some ways the accomplishments of like whatever the 19th century European model was, but is able to actually maintain the civilizational grounding.
Right.
And Yeah, like I just think that is, and even like with, for instance, with like Mao and the Cultural Revolution, I feel like that was an experiment to ask like, can we leap forward? Like, can we leap forward decades or centuries and shed like the old civilizational stuff that Mao had diagnosed as being feudal? But then it turns out that actually like you can't just like shed it all, and that there is a root of civilization that needs to be continued.
Yes.
And I feel like in some ways that's the lesson that like I think Samir is saying, like Deng took it one way, Xi Jinping represents like a new understanding that is grounded in that historical
A new
experience.
synthesis.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, just as a general comment, I'm very interested in what the collapse of Western civilization does to people psychologically and emotionally and morally in some ways. And this is not probably the best example, but I think on the one hand, I agree with Emily that there are increasing numbers of the American people, including white people, who are open to looking at the rest of the world, especially the darker world, with fresh eyes. Simultaneously, I believe that the crisis of Western civilization will, in some ways, push maybe a smaller contingent of the population towards more extreme white supremacist ideas. And this may sound strange, but like a few days ago, I was reading the news about Iran and the US bombing of the 2 big water facilities in Iran, which are, to me, crimes against humanity because those are deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure and the infrastructure that literally supports life. And yeah, I was comparing it to when the US did similar things in Korea, and especially part of what makes it so, I guess, horrific is that so much of this happens while negotiations are underway between, whether it was at that time between the US and South Korea with China and the DPRK, or today with the US and Iran and Israel and all that stuff. And for some reason, this was probably a bad move on my part. I made the post public just because I felt like it was important, and I was kind of surprised because I don't know who shared it, but like I got all these comments from like white people being like, "Good, I'm glad that they did that."
Are they bots?
They may have been bots, but like
So I tell my union stuff all the time.
yeah. So it could be bots. It could be real people. It could be real people who behave like bots. I think that's happening more and more these days.
Wow.
It's like if you go to Twitter, you'll probably see like probably 50% of like replies to everything are bots, but then people who sound like bots who also think that way.
Because they've been influenced by
and they've been
bots.
conditioned to think that way. But it's just like, it's probably not the best example, but I just feel like in some ways, Israel is the classic example of a population, which thankfully I think America is not that consigned to that fate of what Israel is heading towards. But in some ways, Israel is the case example of a society of people who see themselves as part of Western civilization and are increasingly going down the darker and darker road, for which the only future they see for themselves is basically committing the extermination of whether the Palestinians are now, Lebanon, Iran, and all that stuff. And I think that this is a time when those assumptions have to be broken open, and we don't assume that everyone will even hear what we're trying to say. But I think the hope and the faith is that some people will hear it. And that's just like a general comment. And then I think, actually, if I understood correctly, Michelle, you were saying that Zhang Weiwei is open to receiving like interview questions, like written questions from us. So one question, and you may have already covered it, I don't recall, but one question that I had, or a line of questioning that I had, was basically, what does Zhang Weiwei see as the unfinished ideological questions to be worked out with the next phase of China's development?
That's a good way to.
Because, I think it's like, one thing I'm interested in with this whole idea of like the civilization state and even like our purposing of Du Bois to understand that question and how it helps us to better understand China and all that stuff is, in some ways, one could argue that, and I can also be I can get pushback on this because I don't know if I'm right, but like one could argue that someone like Zhang Weiwei's approach towards addressing that question of civilization state is coming from a very Chinese perspective. Like even the four supers and the four others that you mentioned, those are predicated on China's very distinct history, like super long history, super large population, super rich culture. Those are based off of what I feel are Chinese assumptions, which I don't know if we can necessarily say those same things even about Afro-America, because relatively speaking, like America is only 250 years old, all of that stuff. And part of what I feel is really valuable about, there's this debate that I think you guys have brought up between Francis Fukuyama and Zhang Weiwei from, I think it was like around 2010.
It was after this book was published. Shortly after, so 2011. Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's a really good debate. It's worth revisiting because in some ways, Fukuyama has now basically admitted defeat.
Right.
Where he was like, yeah, like America as a superpower is going down. It seems like China is kind of unstoppable and all that stuff. But part of what I think is valuable about even the specific framing that Zhang Weiwei uses about the kind of reference to civilization is that like for China, they know that they've gone through multiple dynasties, then multiple almost eras of testing different ideologies and like placing certain ideologies, like let's say the thought of Sun Yat-sen and even the prior generation of thought of like, Chinese republicanism, all this stuff. And like the way that Zhang Weiwei approaches that question is like, we already tried many of the ideas that have come from the West. We've taken what is useful, but that which has not been useful has already been discarded. And I think that that's one of also, for all that people talk about the supposed homogeneity of China, I think part of what China has done civilizationally in some ways that has allowed it to sustain itself, this is like kind of my interpretation, is that they've been able to absorb ideas from the rest of the world very well, like Buddhism as an example, but also even Marxism is an example. And I think that that's also what makes this moment in history so exciting, is that I think people like Zhang Weiwei represent that part of whether it's the Chinese intellectual, the intelligentsia, or the Chinese people as a whole, who both want to give to the world, but also want to exchange ideas with the world on the premise of good faith and the search for a common future for humanity. And yeah, and I think that's also part of what connects for us, why it resonates so much with someone like Du Bois, because one could say that Du Bois also, like, part of what explains his extraordinary genius is that he was constantly absorbing all of the world currents of thought in the world and then filtering it through and asking, what does this mean for Black people? Like, what does this mean for my people, the future and the freedom of my people? And I think, like, that's part of what I think defines Du Bois as a world thinker, is that he was able to absorb all of the thought that was, whether it's like the Enlightenment, but then also especially with the emergence of the Soviet Union, of the Chinese Revolution and the Indian freedom struggle, like his ability to absorb all of that and to kind of ideologically metabolize it and then release it into like a coherent worldview, I think is part of what I think makes Du Bois very special. And I think is also what I think makes Du Bois a resonant thinker with China's own kind of ideological and intellectual development, as something that has not been stagnant, that has actually changed and evolved a lot. And yeah, because like there's a part in the debate between Fukuyama and Zhang Weiwei where, like, I think Zhang Weiwei, he phrases it as like, wait, let me find it. It was really good. He was like, what is happening in China today? Let me find the quote. he says China is today perhaps the world's largest laboratory of political, economic, social, and legal reforms in the world. And yeah, I just feel like that side of China is like so underappreciated, especially in the West. But I think, sorry, I'm kind of rambling a little bit. But the other aspect of Zhang Wei that I find very interesting is it's in some ways it's not even the direct someone like him speaking directly to a Western audience, but it's like how do people like Zhang Wei speak to the rest of darker humanity, and not just directly confronting the West, but like how do you bring China's message to the rest of the world also, and I bring it up because like Zhang Wei recently did this interview with this Indonesian podcaster, which I recommend. It's really interesting. But it's like, okay, like if there is such a thing as a China model, like of a Chinese civilization state model, like does it have relevance for, let's say, Southeast Asia, for a country like Indonesia, which on the one hand is very different, but also is very large, has a huge population, is underrated in terms of being one of the growing population centers in humanity right now. And I just found it very interesting. And yeah, and then just the last comment is, I think, I don't know if this would be a question, but kind of even related to like what people were bringing up with like the Cultural Revolution, but then even what the civilization state idea means for this time is, how do you, whether it's Zhang Wei or even us, how do you relate the either dynamic or tension between continuity and revolution? Because I think that's one of the questions that China has been working out, but it's like it's very starkly represented in something like the Cultural Revolution, and like what that meant and how China has processed the lessons of the Cultural Revolution. But it's like, if part of the purpose of a revolution is not just to restore something, but is also to transform social relations in a society, then is there such a thing as going too far? Like how do you define what is also the relationship between, especially with a country like China, the continuity of its civilizational development and long history with what were the immediate and kind of modern questions that China has been confronted with. But yeah, I don't know, lots of.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You started with the civilizational crisis of the United States, and then you transitioned to the civilizational state. No, I think it's a very interesting question. Can the United States restore itself or reclaim itself except through the China model, the civilizational state model? Can we do this?
Well, actually, yeah, in some ways, my main takeaway from Alice, Michelle, and Albert's introductory remarks that I think Jeremiah picked up on and you're challenging on is actually this thing of, in some ways, how I see it is, I think I don't know exactly how the Chinese leadership themselves understand their influences. Like, I actually don't know. I've never done research on it, of how they understand their own intellectual or ideological or political influences, self-consciously explaining what model of a state they have. I'm not sure. I haven't read them or I haven't read anyone. But in some ways, I actually think beyond civilization state, in some ways you could argue that someone like Du Bois provides a really solid framework for even explaining how the Chinese state today, as an emerging potential state of the whole people, explaining that is explained better by Du Bois than someone like Marx or Lenin, because we're in this such new period. Because, for example, like I remember weeks ago, Doc once talked about how the whole concept, at least in our language or Doc's language, of the whole concept of state of the whole people is the belief that, most importantly, a state of the whole people is a social center of power, a center of power of the strivings of the people. Like that is a different explanation of this. That's a different explanation of the
Can I just say,
I think what my point was that the state of the whole people
is very Martin Luther King in that it begins with the moral imperative. That's what I was getting at. And I thought I was building upon your idea of King, power, and love.
Yeah, well, I guess because the point I was trying to make is that the state, I think, because another thing you said was like, okay, all states are held together by a certain set of ideas. And so I think China, again, like I don't know actually the self-constructors, I don't know how they self-define at all. I don't know what influence is. I don't completely know how the Chinese state at this point self-defines itself or sees itself moving forward. But what I do think about, the more I was hearing about China and the Chinese state's relationship to the people, the more I felt like the Chinese state, and this is opposite of the US state currently, but the Chinese state sees itself as, it sees itself as necessarily having to best embody the strivings of the Chinese people. Like it sees itself as being an exemplar of the people's, not just needs, but strivings. And the opposite would be true for the US state. But in some ways, actually, Du Bois, you know how Du Bois, we would talk a lot about Du Bois's concept of the immortal child? In some ways, a lot of Du Bois's concepts are not just like nice things he's proposing, or even his definition of democracy. It's him proposing the set of ideas. It's him proposing the set of ideas that a state, like a real state, a people state in the US would be based upon. And in some ways, we would argue that King takes Du Bois and crystallizes through a people's movement the beginnings of what a new state or a state of the whole people would look like in the US.
Yeah.
And but I guess that's what I wanted to say, because like I just think in some ways Du Bois maybe has the best language or best concepts for even understanding what China's trying to achieve without them necessarily being like, oh, because Du Bois said this is how we're governing the state, obviously. But because I think it's important, I just think it's important for us to theoretically define like what makes the Chinese state so astounding in this moment and what King was trying to do. Because actually, when you look at the Communist Party of China, the only equivalent you could have in the US that's similar to the Communist Party of China, just the amount of work they're able to do in terms of sociologically, how do the people feel? Okay, what problems do we need to solve? Okay, what are the political programs to experiment with and propose? The only group I think in the US who has done anything equivalent to that is not even the Communist Party of the US, but it would actually be the SCLC and all the affiliated programs the SCLC had. I mean, that revolutionary core, small group, amongst all the different tentacles or arms of the SCLC, the citizen education program, going into rural areas, doing experiments in citizen education and literacy campaigns. Or you had like Operation Breadbasket in Chicago. So anyways, those are kind of the connections I'm making, because really I'm just in some ways I'm trying to say that in the US, in America, there's no such thing as getting back to the essence of Locke or Hobbes or whatever. Like that is not really in a lot of ways, the struggle in the US is in a moment of self-definition that the set of ideas or the moral imperative or the civilizational essence that would be behind even like the actual concrete state or the governing or all the programs associated with it would have to come from something more similar to what King and the civil rights movement, the Black freedom movement, was beginning to try to consolidate and achieve, or propose at least to the American people.
Because one thing that I was not, it's not like disagreeing with Zhang Weiwei, but he has this formulation about what he calls the genetic defects of like Western style democracy and Western civilization. I don't think he's using it the same way that you're talking about in your article. Anyways, one of them is he says that Western style democracy is too prone to the changing opinions of the people. And even in like the debate with Fukuyama, like Zhang Weiwei is very critical of what he calls populism in the United States, which I think it was kind of jarring to me because I feel like we have a positive view generally of like what we call populism, and but I think part of what I get from it is that for us, polling data may be relevant and important and tell us some things, but ultimately we are not necessarily interested in the opinions of the people, but we're interested in the, like Emily said, the strivings and what can become the will of the people. And I think that in some ways it's a much more difficult project to undertake. And in some ways it's like, one of the examples that comes to mind is there's these great documentaries about the anti-poverty campaigns and the anti-poverty programs in China that I really enjoyed and have always stuck with me, where it'll be like these, not to like give another anecdote, but like it'll be these like CPC, these party members, these party cadre who like go to like a rural village and are like, I have to convince these villagers to like stop, to like, it's like, we need to build a bridge here, but like they don't want to build a bridge there. But it's like, in order for them to have a better life, I need to win them over to building a bridge here. And it's like, I think that's an example where it's like, maybe the opinion of the people in that village is in one direction, but it's like, if the CPC itself is tapped into what it feels is the actual striving of the Chinese people for, let's say, a better life, to see their children's lives improve, both materially and you could say spiritually as well. It's like, okay, then the task of the party is to try to win over the people and to help clarify, like, oh, like even something that may seem so mundane as like building a bridge here as opposed to building a bridge there, it's like that process has to be undergone. And I think you could say the same thing, like to use your example about the Black Freedom Movement, the SCLC. It's like, if one were to just take, quote unquote, the opinions of white people in the South at that time, obviously, one would have said the will of the people was for segregation to remain, right? But it's like, the task of the revolutionaries, whether it's like in the midst of a revolution or even after a revolution, is to try to identify, no, like, even if, let's say, the majority of white people in that time were either staunchly committed to segregation or okay with segregation existing, it's like the basis of the faith and hope of the revolutionaries to be like, no, I believe that even these white people, inside them, there's a striving for something greater. There's a striving for brotherhood with Black people, basically, that they themselves, that white people themselves have not been able to identify and have not even articulated. And I think that's, I don't know, it doesn't really answer the civilization state thing, but it's like, I think that's one of the interesting parallels between.
But it answers the revolutionary question, which I don't think John Weiwei understands, the civil rights movement and what that was. How could he? So he sees all of this as from above. He doesn't see the great move from below. But to me, I don't know whether it answers the civilizational question. It definitely raises it, and it compels us to put it on the table at the center. That's why at the center of the struggle at this point is the question of civilization and the state and the civilization state.
Just to add one quick thing to that, because I was thinking along really similar lines to what you guys had said. But he has language for that explicitly, and I think it came up. It might have even come up when he had done a discussion with an Indian intellectual that Raju and Anita had organized. He makes a distinction between governance by Ming-Yi, which is the opinions of the people and the attitudes, and then Ming-Xing, or Ming-Xing, and Xing is heart. So it's like the will or the civilizational core of the people. And I say that because when I had first read that, it really influenced me. And I felt like it was very akin to our worldview because just more and more in my political approach, I always have this working hypothesis of like, to what extent are the people really searching for that Kimian worldview? And not just the American people, but the world's people. And I just want to emphasize that point because I think it's very. I mean, it is an achievement of governments that they govern by the will of the people and not reacting to the opinions.
I wanted to, what you were saying about Zhang Wei in terms of like top down is I actually see that that's where he's potentially moving to, or Albert and Michelle can correct me, which is that what I'm trying to say is that what has happened, that what China has been able to achieve, I don't even think China itself has a complete understanding of how it all happened. And the reason why I say that is because I think there's a recognition that the people made this possible. I think in a way that we say like, yes, the party was instrumental to where China has gone, but I think the state also, and the state and its leadership are not only trying to uplift the people, but they also know that the people have been key to building these bridges, to sending their children to schools, to doing like all these things that has been part of the achievement of China. And I think the question,
16 hours a day.
yeah, for essentially like, or what I was trying to get to is that I think it was developing so rapidly, and there were certain civilizational like assumptions of the people. But I think part of what now, the way Zhang Wei was like, yeah, I didn't expect this to happen, or the amount of achievement that China has been able to go through. And I think now retroactively, there is the question of what was it about the Chinese people that not just civilizational, but also forward-looking, that was able to, like have a generation of people that sacrificed so much of their lives, working all day, like the worst, like just the backbreaking work of sending their children, of making money, sending their children to schools, all of that. Because now this new generation is living in a time when there are certain luxuries, like there's things that society is able to provide them, and also a certain level of consciousness of the world. And I think that's what I kind of got from Michelle, which is that I think young people are trying to broaden their horizons of like what is out there in the world, what are not just the Chinese people, but also other people thinking about, talking about. And I think part of the irony is that these students come to the US or come wherever, and they're like, oh shoot, actually, I think there's something back home actually that I took for granted, or that it's better actually. Life is in some ways better back home. But what I'm getting to is that even in Chinese discourse now, I think the Chinese people are increasingly conscious of their civilizational values and the transformation actually that's needed in a China that's different from a decade ago, 2 decades ago. And like an example is that there's like a running joke of Chinese people, which is that it's like if you get a 98 out of 100 on a test score and you bring it to your parents, I mean, maybe this is Asian, but you bring it to your parents and then your parents are like, why didn't you get 100? Instead of like, oh, wow, you got a 98 on but the reason why I say that is because like parents are also assessing like how do you raise your children? Like they had gone through a generation where it's like you have to keep pressing forward, but now they've come to a level where it's like, do they still need that 100, or is there something actually more to life than building bridges and getting into college and all of that, which are still important. But I say that as an example because I think the Chinese people are also, or at least my sense of things, is that they're self-reflecting on the values that they've had for a long time that are civilizational and how it needs to adapt to a new China, a new society. There was another point, which is, the other thing is that I think this recognition of, and I don't know if this is premature, is that a recognition of the Chinese people that they are being looked at by the world. I think for the most part of history, like China has been like a pretty, I don't know if this is Confucian or whatever, wherever it comes from, but generally like a very humble like nation. where, it's not similar to the West where you have a name on a building, like for yourself. Like the names are Sun Yat-sen and Mao and all, but there's not like putting your name on a chair or putting your name on a building. You always have your host of characters that are more flamboyant and things like that. But I think for the most part, they're kind of low key. And I think what they're recognizing right now is that the world is looking to them of whether it's certain responsibilities, being such a massive player. And the question now is like, how does it step into that role? And in terms of its relationships to other nations, in terms of the Chinese people in relation to other peoples as well. At least I think those are the two things, which is like increasingly there is a question of how have the Chinese people changed, because so much has happened. And so the same notions that the people have are not the same. And then this is just like another anecdote that I already told Emily, and I don't know how it's relevant, but I found this so interesting, which is there is the economic development of a people, but how do you have people in a society that become modern or are becoming modern? Because I think there was a simple question that I guess Nanata raised and then passed through Emily, and then it got to me, and I was like, oh wait, how did that happen? Which is that several decades ago, or even a decade or two ago, people would spit on the streets and litter on the streets and whatever, right? And so that's not really something that's like, in some ways it's regulated by law, but you can't possibly lock up every person or fine every person that throws on a banana peel on the street. And so this question is like, how is it that in two generations where you have like grandmas and uncles and all that are like littering, they're like whatever it is, to now a society that's super clean, not just because there's police people that are like, hey man, you can't throw your garbage on the streets. There's like civil discourse. There's also cleaning on the streets. My aunt was saying like in the neighborhood, like every day they're like washing the streets. And I guess that's the question of governance. But then the third part is like the people too are not littering as much as they used to in the past. And so how does that behavior change to upkeep a society? And at least like the answer she gave me is that it's through the education of the young that it happens, where young children in schools are taught like not to curse, not to throw garbage on the floor, all this stuff. And then when the older generation does that, the younger children will be like, hey, you can't do that. And then like after time and time, slowly like behaviors of the family also change. Because I think that's like the economic is incredible too, but what are the kinds of people that was able to bring this forth? Because it is true, like I guess none of the younger generation maybe can imagine like what their parents had to go through to create this new society for them. And I think ultimately that's the question that we're asking in America, and similar to what I guess Emily you were saying, which is what is a movement or a revolutionary body that can actually unleash the potential of the people, of the masses of the people, to bring forward the necessary changes in society. Because whatever is being built in China didn't just happen because of the party. It required the millions of people in China. And I think what's apparent here is that a new society can be built, but the people are part of that. Yeah.
I wanted to qualify something that Alice just said, which is that, and something that Michelle said, which is if you look at the number of Chinese people who come to the United States, I think Michelle is right. There hasn't been, a retreat of the Chinese people from coming to the West, getting an education, trying to know about this society. But at the same time, there has been a lot more people going back to China. Like back in the early 2000s, I think maybe 15% of Chinese would choose to return, and now currently that number is up to 85%. Most people choose to return. So I think what Michelle said is true, that they have this urge to know about the world that is being taught to them, but they're also recognizing, as Alice said, their own society and what it offers. And I think that also comes down to what their relationship with their own state is. I was thinking about something that Jeremiah said, and it reminded me of this show called Minningtown, which Alice and I watched recently. And it's about the Chinese poverty alleviation program. And in it, you see that these Chinese families are being told by the Communist Party's cadres to relocate from the desert to a different area. And they don't want to go. They relocate and then they go back to their homes where they have to live in poverty. But the process was about these cadres going back to them and trying to convince them that this is what is going to, this is the broad plan. If we get 60 families, we'll get electricity, we'll build poles, we'll build a dam, we'll build a bridge. And it was a long process. And there was nothing like, oh, I'm going to put you into this truck and we're going to go whether you like it or not. Part of the entire process was actually trying to talk to the people and say how this is going to serve society. And I think that's a very democratic process. You talk to people, you try to convince them of something that you feel is good for the betterment of society. And I think even when it comes to education, and maybe this will answer your question, if you see that the Chinese sort of testing whole infrastructure, it is true that a lot of people in the world, a lot of countries in the world have a similar infrastructure. The US has the SATs, India has a lot of different testing infrastructures, like national tests and everything. But in China, yes, if you fail the exam, you have the Chinese state doesn't abandon you. They say that, okay, we're going to try to figure out where your talents lie. And we're going to put you into a program that helps you develop those talents, and you get a job based on that. Now, this is, of course, different from what happens in the US. You get a low SAT score, and you can still do engineering or whatever. If you want to be a mechanical engineer, you can still be a mechanical engineer. But you would have to go to one of these schools which are low-tiered. They're extremely privatized. They take a lot of money, and there's no guarantee of you getting a job afterwards. You have the degree, you did the degree in whatever you wanted to do, but then what? The state has abandoned you from that point, or even before that. And if you see what is happening in the University of California now, a lot of UCs have abandoned the use of SATs, and they're just picking people based on their CGPA and their essay. All of their essays are written by AI, and all of their CGPAs are perfect. And then they come into these advanced mechanical engineering classes and say, why is 1/2 plus 1/3 5/6? They can't do simple fractions. And now a lot of UC professors are getting together and saying that we want these standardized tests back. So, I feel like there is a reason why the Chinese state, has these 5-year plans. They plan out what is good for society, for the people. And I think that the people overall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, trust the process. And you can see by the accounts of a lot of Chinese people going back to China. that it is in some way or the other gaining the trust of the people and allowing them to progress for the betterment of their own individual self as well as society.
No, I think for me, it's not about the tests themselves. It's about also the difference in the two societies because, like, let's face it, most kids in the US are not even going to take the SATs because they're barely graduating from high school. And there can be no meritocracy in the US because there's the color line. And inherently, like King said, there is two Americas. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't really, you'll never even know the full potential of every child in the US. You'll never even be able to grade them and you'll never be able to even test them because the potential itself has not been developed. And it's because the education system, first of all, the education system on the whole in the US is so low. And most people in Philly are trying to send their kids to Catholic school or to private school or to charter school, anything that's not public school. Most kids are trying to escape public school. And so you don't even know the full potential of a child since 3 years old. Since 3 years old, every child is basically set up to just throw them in the gutter and see what happens. So there's not even a way to measure, to even do meritocracy in the US because meritocracy is not possible in the US where everything is basically determined by the color line. And it's kind of like, that's why Du Bois is basically always like, how many hidden geniuses are there in America? Like, especially behind the veil in Black America. How many hidden geniuses are there? You will never know because this is not a society where there's enough structure or laws for you to even allow every child to have an equal chance to unfurl their petals and blossom, and then you can measure the flowers. It's like, how are you supposed to measure the flowers when most of the flowers aren't even like able to blossom at all? Whereas in China, in some ways you could argue, in China, you can, to a certain degree, have basically, meritocracy is not a dirty word in China. Because even the kids from the rural areas, even the kids from what you could consider the poorer children, everyone goes to the same schools. Everyone, to a large extent, is given, to a certain degree, relatively equal chance. And so every child, what you get, like Alice was saying, is the Communist Party of China's cadre has so many young people who apply and get in, who are from all different backgrounds, minorities, lower class, rural areas, which is why, like Shantanu, you were raising, for poverty alleviation programs, they will always choose the cadre members who are from those actual villages, because you actually have people from those different backgrounds. Whereas like in the US, these politicians who are not even, you can't consider them to be real leaders of the American people. They're not reflective of any strive. It's not reflective of anything that connects them to the people of the US. It doesn't matter what race you are. If you are in political office, it means you probably had to make a compromise somewhere along the way that puts you against the people's strivings. But all these politicians, like, you can, to a large degree, know their background, at least their educational background. It's not like the Communist Party of China at all. I think that to me, like, actually the testing thing is more interesting to me because in China, in some ways, you can actually have meritocracy to a certain degree.
Yeah.
In the US, you will never, because of the color line, ever. You will never, ever, ever have an attempt.
In a society that's completely anti-children, we just can never forget that or normalize it. This is an anti-children society, and anybody with children or grandchildren is worried every single moment because your child could be killed. Your child could come under the influence of this commercialized pop culture. You don't have that in China. If there's nothing, just one small thing, Jerry. If there's nothing, one thing everybody everywhere knows, that China protects its children. I don't know, are there homeless children in China? You don't see it. Are there any children that don't go to school in China? I mean, and that is the measure, and that's what Du Bois was saying,
Yes.
even in 1959. And he was, by the way, he was angry when he was angry at the United States, and he was angry at black leaders in the United States. And if you read that speech, and he said, I'm in a country where all of my life, in my country, where all my life I've been nothing but a nigger. Mm-hmm. You understand? And he's saying that in China. By the way, it was illegal at that time to travel to China. Mm-hmm. And he praised China. And he was bitter at black Americans who allowed he and Paul Robeson and others to come under the harsh treatment of the state. And they were so cowardice that they could not stand up. And we black Americans, I just have to tell, we live with that legacy. That is a stronger part of the leadership class of black people than the Du Boisian Kingian traditions. And so, how do you say it? I mean, it's a troubling, very troubling thing that any black person with a modicum of morality would have to say that almost the entire blackness leadership or the entire political class of black people have capitulated to a society and to a ruling elite that hates black children and will see them on the street, see them suffering, give them guns, whatever. That's not China. And I think that all of these stories, we have to make this narrative available to black folk in this year. They must know that there is an alternative to what Du Bois called this hell, you know? And I would say just one other small thing, you know, children need examples. And I don't think there's a better example than W.E.B. Du Bois for so many, well, Blaze knows this, for even the 2-year-olds, you know, that they begin life seeing the photo of W.E.B. Du Bois, of Martin Luther King. And that's what I wanted to say. The state of the whole people is the state of children. The state for children, that's what I want to say.
That's why I do I feel very passionate about us even seeing Du Bois as a theorist of governance, a theorist of the state, because like this conversation made me take so seriously when he, like the whole concept of an immortal child. Yeah. I mean, that is a proposal, like Alice was talking about, negative freedom for positive freedom. It is a proposal that negates or redefines or challenges the bourgeois liberal state. This idea of that the most important definition of the state is how it is acting or operating according to the Constitution or according to the laws. Instead, Du Bois is essentially proposing, well, what about the criteria being about what is the state doing for the immortal child or doing against the immortal child? Like, I think that is, and that's why I was like, in some ways, that is a better language or framework or criteria of governance in the state that helps even explain what China is beginning to do or currently doing. Like, and, or even like the way Du Bois says, the antithesis of democracy is not authoritarianism or fascism, whatever that means. The enemy of democracy, the antithesis of democracy is poverty, is degradation of the worker, is war. Like, it is a redefining
on education too.
Ignorance. It is a redefining of the state through civilizational terms, through very human moral terms. That basically says like, it's a proposal of it's like in some ways it's totally a break. I feel like it is a pretty fundamental break from like certain political theory that people assume the American state and the future of the American state must abide by.
Just a quick thing. See, I think, you know, as we have talked this thing out for the last couple of weeks, I think the argument almost makes itself that the bourgeois state is an unsustainable project at this stage in history. It is unsustainable, and that the alternative to it is the state of the whole people. based upon what King called the beloved community. And, I know with Blake, from the day one, children must be taught that the highest value is love, not individual
Right.
wealth, and all of these images of rich people and all to black kids, these celebrities and with gold and all. This is poison in the veins of a child. This is, and so it's a very deepening, and it's very right in front of us that the state has failed, that the liberal state has failed. It cannot be reformed, and thus a new state formed, a state of the people based, and then we have to say, what are its values? And it must begin with the values as the criteria, not, quote, the policies. What are the values that you are operating on? And every mother and father in this city would say, look, that's what I want. This doesn't work. It's easy. It's not, we don't have to go a distance. We have won it already, in terms of the theoretical argument. It is to make the argument available to as many people as possible. Like Calvin has said, help me to make the argument.
I like this idea of the state of the whole people being one that has the child at the center.
Yeah.
Because we can have the people without the child. But I was thinking on sort of a different track, where I was very interested in this question that people are exploring. What is the consequence of China's world historic success on the consciousness of the American people? And what does that mean for our future? And I was thinking about some parallels to earlier times in American history and some distinctions from those times today. Jeremiah had shared a King's speech or essay on Facebook. I forget the title.
It's actually a version of what was also the first chapter in Why We Can't Wait. But he also gave it as a speech called The Summer of Our Discontent.
There's a lot to it, but one of the things King is laying out is a rationale for why now, and why is this revolutionary movement, and he uses those terms, that language, happening now amongst Black America. And Coretta also has kind of versions of this reasoning where they're laying out, you have the anniversary of a great moment of freedom, the Emancipation Proclamation, and yet you have the clear unfreedom within the society. At the same time, you have around the world, Coretta would say, we saw the anti-colonial movements happening. They have this mirror, and you have a crisis. And from that came this kind of awakening or urgency of a new consciousness, a new revolutionary consciousness amongst the people. And I feel like what we've been putting forward is a similar mirror and crisis, where we have, the American people have the mirror of China, the society that cares about the child, and the crisis of American society, which is even maybe more acute than in 1963, where we have this long suffering of people in unfreedom. And we have the 250th anniversary to remind us and stoke this conversation of what does a society for the people actually look like, and do we have it? And anecdotally, even my cousins who are mixed Korean and white, grew up in West Philly. I was talking with my uncle the other day, and they're really into China. They think China is cool, basically. Like they're seeing on social media this world that they didn't have access to, that they don't have access to in America, going through high schools where they feel like they're in prison more than they're in school. And what does that do to,
Jesus said,
what does that do to their mind? You know, is that, I guess, anecdote from Michelle's recounting of her conversation with the butcher too.
Yeah.
It's not even the mirror in the crisis affecting a segment of the American population like in 1963, which was the black
yeah.
people, but you have it now even affecting the consciousness of the white people, the healthcare worker too. That mirror in that crisis producing a new consciousness, which has great potential.
Yeah, there's just one point which may sound a little out of left field, but actually part of the questions that we've raised, it reminded me of this thing of AI and data centers, which are quickly becoming one of the most consequential political, I think, developments within the United States. At least as far as I see it, and I think it's interestingly galvanized like a lot more local, like across the country, a lot more local pushback and essentially outcry from people, like ordinary people across the country. And I only bring it up as a point of comparison that there was like polling done, I think last year, and 87% of Chinese people say that they trust AI, compared with 32% of Americans trusting AI. And the reason I bring it up is because that statistic is exactly mirroring the trust of Chinese people in their government and the American people's distrust of their government. And I think it's just partially reflective of like, it's not even so much about the technology itself, but it's like hidden within it is essentially the people's trust and legitimacy in the state, and whether the state is interested in actually protecting and safeguarding the well-being of the people. And I feel like it's also because there's been a lot of like, New York Times has a lot of coverage about the AI race, for example, between China and America. But it's like, part of the fundamental difference is that China and the US see the purpose of AI completely differently. Whereas like in the US, AI is led by these Silicon Valley people who literally have like apocalyptic designs and dreams about how they're going to use this technology, genocidal ambitions almost, about how they want to use this technology to like become God and basically make obsolete the rest of the population. And it's like, that's part of the mix of why Americans so distrust AI, but even specifically like these like data centers that no one knows anything about. And it's like, because of the work that I do, which is in part like what's called economic development work, like communities across, like it's in Pennsylvania, it's in the Midwest, it's everywhere. It's like, you'll have these town hall meetings where it's like basically the public officials, the city officials, the city council people will have already made essentially like deals and agreements with these big tech companies that come in and be like, okay, we're gonna give you this tax incentive to come in, build a giant data center here. And all of it is done basically under wraps, like in secret, hidden from the public. And you can see when these town hall meetings happen, and it's like, it's both the city council people and the big tech companies that are essentially trying to like maneuver and trying to trick people. And to be like, no, actually this is good, we'll create jobs, but it's like, where are the jobs that come with data centers? There aren't any. There are no jobs that come with data centers, except for like the handful of technicians that like basically maintain them. And it's like, that is so directly contrasted with but at least what I understand of like the Chinese process, not just with AI, but with like this whole question of governance itself. And whereas in the American model, it's like people feel like they are being experimented on, that their lives are being gambled upon, and that they're being lied to constantly, whether it's by the government or by like these big corporations that come in with all these promises. It's like at least as far as I understand, like in the Chinese process, like they have this, I think their term for it is what they call whole process people's democracy, which is,
Say that again.
they call it whole process people's democracy, which is their way of, for instance, how they develop the 5-year plans every cycle, which is like, Zhang Wenwei talked about it. He's like, we go through tens of thousands of consultative sessions with people across China across all of these regions, these autonomous zones and local communities, bigger regional zones and all that stuff. And it's like, that is the basis of, even what Alice was saying, like the bottom up, part of the bottom up nature of what becomes also it's almost like bottom up and top down in terms of the governing process, where it's like, they're constantly getting feedback from the people, and then that informs the strategy of where China sees itself next 5, 10, 15 years. And in that sense, it's like, part of what's so ironic is that, yeah, like the whole construction of like the authoritarian versus democratic like thing by the West is, and actually the lived experience of being in America right now is the absence of transparency, the feeling that all of these decisions are made on your behalf and gambling with your life that you have never had any kind of say in. Whereas like even like the direct experience that Alice has shared so much is like, when people, like ordinary people in China, even if they're not part of the governing structure, they feel that if they're really dissatisfied with something, they actually know who they can talk to. They know that actually it will actually be listened to and heard, and that if it's like a serious thing, that it will be changed. Whereas like in America, it's like, no, like basically you feel like your government is in cahoots with like all of these giant like companies and like the University of Pennsylvania, all that stuff. Yeah, pedophiles also. And like, they're the ones who are making the decisions. And if there's any veil of quote unquote procedural democracy, that increasing numbers of Americans feel like that is all a sham, a veil, a lie, an illusion. And like all of the real conversations are happening somewhere else.
Because I feel like even most people, like the polls say, like most people believe that you have no like avenue, or that the parties don't represent you. And in some ways, the existential question on the American people's mind is like, if this doesn't represent me, how do I even get my opinions, my voice, my strivings to be reflected in the broader like government or in the state itself? And I feel like the crazy thing is that in China, it seems like both there's transparency about what the structure is, and it actually is responsive, such that like it is crazy to know like, oh, like I could actually talk to this person who is like available or is a part of the state. Whereas it's like, even if you hypothetically speak to your city council member, you know that they don't really represent you.
And they're usually
like,
just trying to hide from people.
yeah, and they aren't really that interested in speaking to you unless it's election time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I know we have to get to the chat, but I know if you live in certain neighborhoods, drugs are allowed and drug crews are allowed on the corners. And you have to, my daughter has to come out of her house with her 2 daughters, and you can go to the local police station right around the corner, or you can go to the city councilwoman and you get nothing done. I've been with my daughter and she was weeping, trying to explain to this representative of Cindy Bass, what it's like a few doors from her. And, you know what I'm saying? And so, at this point, the system is not, there is no governance. There is no governance. And what you say, Emily, about your healthcare workers, any person that works with children, from 2 years old up to high school, your heart is broken. This is a corrupt and failed system. And there is no way, and I think we need to go straight ahead with the argument. And there, that's how, I'm sorry to talk a little too much. The state of the whole people. The very idea of the whole people is a convincing and appealing idea. And the whole question of the collapse of the state reflected in the collapse of the government. We can work this thing out in argument after argument. We have to help Mos 12, Mos Miriam, Mother Bethel, wherever we can to think this thing through.
Yeah, that's why I think both our work with King and like Black Gods, for example, all of it, whether it's Du Bois or King or the Black Gods, all of it comes down to the same thing, which is proposing a positive,
Yeah,
alternative,
yeah,
realistic
Yeah.
path for the
Yeah.
people of
absolutely.
not just transforming society, but the people themselves
Yeah.
can transform.
And giving the people that option to transform themselves, their neighborhoods, their churches, whatever. It's,
Because they all act like alternative governments.
yeah,
All the Black Gods, they never stayed in their own mosque or church. It was always creating the ideology, the theology itself led
Yeah.
people to create alternative programs, social programs, political programs. And then you really have with King a broad people's movement doing the same, acting like an alternative.
Yeah, because I think part of what I think is deep about the sociology study and the study of the Black Gods institutions too is that we're not saying that there is a lack of like even theories of governance. The reason why China is valuable is that it shows that it is possible on a mass scale and at the level of the state. But I feel like part of what we're doing is to try to bridge the existing theories of governance, which are rich, where there are many experiments and there's a lot of experience actually. I think even like this thing of like, I guess like the institutions now reaching like 100 years of like development and experience and history. But I think connecting that to like this taking the state, achieving state power and achieving like a state of the whole people, I think is like a new step that we need to work out. But I feel like it's not that we're saying that like, oh, we just need to like imitate China and like we don't have anything. Like it's actually, we actually do.
yeah, have a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're trying to do with our July 4th event too, which would probably be worth us announcing. In the title.
So we're going to be doing for the people who are here, we're doing a special, and the chat, we're doing a special Saturday free school on July 4th, which is a Saturday. And it's in partnership with Mother Bethel's Freedom School.
Yes, and I think we ourselves should see it as part of a 2-day program, one of which is ours, and then the next day will be a service. Anyways, okay, first go to July 4th and then I'll explain it.
So it'll be that Saturday, July 4th at Mother Bethel. And the special free school is titled, "We Must Win Our Freedom, a People's Declaration of Resistance and Purpose." And so we're going to start outside of Mother Bethel AME around the Richard Allen statue. And we're gonna have people read the Free Schools Declaration for the year, our Declaration of Resistance and Purpose. And then we're gonna go inside to Mother Bethel, and for a few hours, Doc will start with a presentation on Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. And I think just the larger Birmingham campaign and how we're making sense of the 250th for the United States. And then there will be discussion.
The performances?
Oh, performances as well. Yeah, we're gonna have at most 2 singers, one of which is Osiris Wildfire and the other is Jillian, who is a singer in the training or style of Marian Anderson.
She's also the director of the Marian Anderson Museum.
Yeah.
And then July 5th will be Mother Bethel is like, it's a complement to what we're doing on July 4th, where their service will be dedicated to Frederick Douglass. And it comes from Frederick Douglass's "What Does the 4th of July Mean to the Slave" speech. And then after service, they'll actually do a recitation, a short program on that actual speech. And so for us, I think it's really important that we also attend their July 5th service and the program that they have. And for all the people who have Juneteenth off, Doc, myself, and maybe Jeremiah will be tabling at Mother Bethel's Juneteenth.
Which is June 19th.
Yeah, which is June 19th, Juneteenth Fair, where we'll be actually publicizing the event and then giving away booklets and also just having some good conversations about our declaration of 250th. So if anyone wanted to come and attend and be a part of it, you can. But okay, I guess the chat. We just wanted to share in case there are people in the chat who wanted to come.
I think Samir, did you want to say something before?
Yeah, so I guess more information about the July 4th event will be upcoming, but we'll share the flyer once we have it soon. Okay, there were some new commenters in the chat today. So the usual folks, Sparks, Bambala, Nathan Reddy, Todd said good morning. Nathan said, I'm interested in how the formulation of China rejecting white supremacy relates to Asian American narratives and Asian American studies narratives, including Chinese American narratives that also, quote, reject whiteness. Todd responded, I think foundationally China's understanding of whiteness is probably very different from the bourgeois academic definition of whiteness. Jupiter Hammond asked, zero state oppression, 3 question marks. What about the Uyghurs? What about the Hukou system? And then Nathan Reddy said, Uyghurs, because the West cares so much about the safety and welfare of Muslims. Hence they're bringing the alarm. Bambala says, China is a civilization, and a civilization is civilized conduct among its inhabitants. They know their do's and don'ts. They want to taste the steamed bun that Michelle and Emily were describing.
Yeah, that was very accurate. That was honestly, by the way, that's very accurate. Like mantou is like the basis of the entire Chinese civilization in the north.
Bambala said, the USA is all about profit. And then I think this might be a first-time commenter, but their handle is him2clean2. It says, top of the morning school. Even though my finals and quarter are done, I still tune in to the Saturday free school. And Todd said, you're very committed. Megna said, Alice's example of her aunt makes me think that sacrifice is a prerequisite for freedom. Freedom without sacrifice is privilege at the expense of others.
Oh, that's really deep.
Yeah.
That's a really deep.
Yeah, that's really deep. And then Bambala agreed with Under Pressure, where saying you give what you can to benefit others. That's a civilization. And I feel like that goes into this concept of like the state of the whole people. Like even recognizing that there is such a thing as the whole people, and that you are part of it, so you give to it. And that's where you basically derive like freedom or rights or privileges. Okay. Bambala says, back to the African proverb or the John Donne poet, quote, no man is an island. President Jesus asked, how is this conversation any different from the concept of nationalism? And then I don't know what this handle is, but they were describing that the claim that China is authoritarian is propaganda and Western journalism. And then, let's see, Bernadette Rogers asked, is higher education free in China? What is the violent crime rate? And then Contrapleurs and said, it's very low crime rates. I looked it up and apparently it's like 4 times less per capita, like per person than in the US. And yeah, I think college tuition is like a few $1,000s at most. And then, let's see, well said, China has happier and wealthier, safer cities. People asked to keep things cool and be respectful, that's the basis of free school. Said, the facts are important and the colonizer media lied to all of us. And then, let's see, Kari said, Alice, Michelle, Albert, and Emily spent the first 2 hours giving their firsthand experiences and observations of China. And that can't just be overruled by claiming that China is an authoritarian state. Contrapleurs, and I don't think I'm pronouncing it right, but said, grateful for your sharing about the experiences. Let's see, Lao Tzu 2120 asked if there's a contact point for the free school. And let's see.
An email.
Yes, we have our email, which is freeschoolmedia@gmail.com. Then Contrapleurs N says, I don't know what they're referring to, but says, it's got to be seen as a behavioral shift, whether it's Chinese or not. Ultimately, what's sustainable and ethical will prevail. And then President Jesus said that they think that we're inverting the base and the superstructure. There's some discussion about the United States as a settler colonial state. Jupiter Hammond said, no, because the US is a former settler colony as a nation state modeled on European civilization, with racism central to its socioeconomic construct. And Emil Carr said, yes, the US is an active settler colonial state. I feel like we've discussed this premise a lot when we had our free schools on Gerald Horne, like whether there is, like basically whether the United States has any legitimacy and whether that's the ultimate thing that matters or whether the reality of 250 years of America and the experience of
That's very
the Black
interesting.
military.
You know, like Gerald's position is the US state was never legitimate.
Mhm.
It was always illegitimate.
Prison House of Nations.
I said again,
Prison House of Nations.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, and then Melanatata says, I appreciate what you guys do very much. And let's see, Exoduster says that they wonder if certain people, like I think John, can be spoken to, not on the free school, but I've always wondered this in my encounters with many people. There's a difference between making prescriptive statements versus talking about what speaks to your own aspirations. Let's see, Medusa Usi says, I spent 2 weeks in China last summer and it was nothing like I'd been told. It's very progressive and it seemed that the government tries to fulfill goals that are in the best interest of its citizens. The US has been colonized by its greatest Middle East ally, in my honest opinion, referring to Israel. And then President Jesus, who I think has been making a series of questions, says, I just don't see the relevance of China to the US. The experiences and conditions are night and day. Okay. Magna said, America imports immigrants who will accept an unjust system if it gives them a chance to advance rather than educate its people. It's a joke compared to societies which believe in the human potential of people. Magna is writing an article for our next issue of Avant-Garde on immigrants. So she will be able to expand on that idea. Okay. Jupiter Hammond said, the US and the West have a symbiotic relationship with China. Says, China saved capitalism in exchange for development from surplus capital after the century of humiliation, a Faustian bargain. I guess that's referring to the Deng Xiaoping era, but let's see then. Okay. Exoduster, who says, I honestly owe so much to this group. I certainly felt left behind until I came across this. Kari's and liked what you last said, Doc. Amilcar says, it's capitalism that failed. And then Rami237 said, if capitalism ever worked, it failed a long time ago. Long-term planning is what's needed. Exoduster, when talking about the city council and the big tech companies in cahoots, says, or they just don't show up to the town hall at all. In my case. Then, okay, let's see. Fireplay is critical of Juneteenth, saying Juneteenth, another colonial holiday where the Black proletariat has to work, while white civilization gets to kick back and relax.
Yeah.
What a slap in the face.
No, we agree.
we're
We
not
are
all
not. We don't support Juneteenth. It's just that,
Let us use it.
it's important to be
Present.
present.
Okay, and then Heidi Monteith says, thank you to everyone who presented and participated in discussion. Today was a really interesting topic. Okay, thank you to all of our commenters. Yeah, I feel like it was a great discussion of comments today.
I know. The chat is really holding it down.
Yes.
Okay, we'll be back next
Next
Saturday.
We will be back next Saturday. We will have flyers to distribute, and we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, bye.
Bye.